The poisoned wine was already at the Iron King's lips, surrounded by smiling traitors. His death was just one swallow away. Then, a tiny, desperate voice shattered the icy silence of the great hall. "Don't drink that, my king!" A 7-year-old girl, the daughter of a lowly castle maid, stepped out of the shadows, pointing a trembling finger at the royal cup. A dozen guards instantly drew their swords. Her mother gasped, thrown herself forward, bracing for the execution order. But instead of fury, the most feared ruler in the realm slowly lowered his glass, locking eyes with the fragile child who had just saved his life, and the terrified maid who was about to thaw his frozen heart. The morning after the poison was found, Ashford Castle woke to the sound of iron doors slamming and boots marching through every corridor. Margaret had not slept. She had spent the night sitting on the edge of Alice's cot, watching her daughter's small chest rise and fall, listening to the distant shouts of guards and the clatter of weapons being checked and rechecked. The castle, which had always felt like a vast, indifferent machine, now seemed to hum with a new and dangerous energy. When the knock came at door, she was already dressed, her hair pinned tight, her hands steady from years of practice in hiding fear. "Mistress Margaret." The guard was young, his face pale beneath his helmet. "The king requires your presence." "And the child's." Alice sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Is the king angry, Mama?" "I don't know, my love." But she did know. A king who had almost been murdered did not summon a maid and her child for pleasant conversation. She took Alice's hand, felt the small fingers curl around hers, and walked into the corridor with her head held high. The great hall, when they reached it, was transformed. The long table had been pushed against the wall, replaced by a semicircle of chairs around a raised dais. On the dais sat William, dressed in a dark tunic embroidered with the silver stag of House Ashford, his face unreadable. To his right stood Lord Cedric, a slender man with a neatly trimmed grey beard and eyes that moved too quickly to be trustworthy. To his left stood Elena the housekeeper, her arms crossed, her expression fierce. Margaret curtsied, pulling Alice down beside her. "Your Majesty." "Mistress Margaret," William's voice was flat, "you are aware that the entire castle has been searched, and no trace of the poisoner has been found." "Yes, your Majesty, they will find him," Lord Cedric interjected, his voice smooth as oil. "But in the meantime, your Majesty, I must insist, with the deepest respect, that the circumstances of this warning be examined more closely." Margaret felt the words like a slap. She had known, of course, that suspicion would fall on her. A maid who happened to know about the poison, a maid whose daughter had conveniently been in the cellar at exactly the right moment. It was too neat, too convenient. "Lord Cedric speaks wisely," William said, and Margaret's heart dropped. "It is strange that my wine was poisoned on the very night a new maid's child chose to wander where she should not have been." Alice stiffened beside her. "I was following the cat," she said, her voice small but clear. "The grey one with the white paws. She went into the cellar, and I followed her, and that's when I saw the man." Lord Cedric smiled thinly. "A cat, of course." "It's true!" Alice's voice rose. "She's the one who's always stealing the bread from the kitchens. Mama says she's a clever thief, and I wanted to see where she hid it." Silence. Then unexpectedly a sound from the dais, a low, rumbling noise that might have been a laugh suppressed. Margaret looked up, startled, and saw the corner of William's mouth twitch. "The grey cat with the white paws," he repeated. "That would be the same creature that has been evading my kitchen staff for 3 years. I had wondered where she kept her hoard." Alice nodded vigorously. "She hides it behind the barrels. There's a hole in the wall, and she's very proud of it." Lord Cedric's smile had frozen on his face. "Your Majesty, this is hardly relevant to the matter at hand." "On the contrary, Lord Cedric." William leaned back in his chair, his eyes moving slowly, deliberately from the courtier to the child. "The child has just explained exactly how she came to be in the cellar. She followed a known pest. That is what children do. It is not a conspiracy." He rose, and the room seemed to shrink around him. "Mistress Margaret, your daughter has done me a great service. I have decided that you will both be moved to the West Tower, where the rooms are warmer and the windows are fitted with proper glass. You will remain there until I have determined who was responsible for the wine." Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. The West Tower was reserved for the king's personal household, his secretary, his personal physician, his most trusted attendants. It was not a place for a scullery maid and her child. "Your Majesty, I am not worthy of such—" "You will do as I command," William said, cutting her off. There was no cruelty in his voice, only the flat finality of a man who was not accustomed to being questioned. "Elena will see to your belongings. You will have the room with the blue door, the one with the view of the garden." Lord Cedric's face had gone very still. "Your Majesty, is it wise to reward a woman before her account has been fully examined? I mean only to protect you." "I am aware of what you mean, Lord Cedric." William's voice was ice. "And I am equally aware that the poison was placed in my wine by a man who knew which jug I would be served from, and which servant would carry it. That is not the work of a maid and her child. That is the work of someone with access to my household, someone who knows my habits." He turned to Margaret, and for a moment, just a moment, something flickered in his deep blue eyes. It was gone before she could name it. "You will go with Elena now. I will speak with her again this evening." It was Fournay a request. Margaret curtsied, pulled Alice's hand, and followed the housekeeper out of the great hall. The west tower was cold, despite what William had promised. The room with the blue door was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a wooden chest, and a window that looked out over the castle's walled garden. Margaret stood at the window, watching the grey autumn light fade over the bare fruit trees, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. "He was kind to us," Alice said, from where she sat on the bed swinging her legs. "The king, he was kind." "He was careful," Margaret corrected gently. "That is not the same thing." But she was not so sure. She had been in the castle for 3 years, invisible, unnoticed, a pair of hands that scrubbed floors and mended torn seams. The king had never looked at her before. She had been certain he did not know her name. And yet, this morning, he had called her mistress, Margaret. He had given her a room with glass in the windows. He had looked at her daughter and not flinched. Alice slid off the bed and padded to the window, pressing her nose against the cold glass. "Mama, look, there's a cat in the garden, the grey one with the white paws." Margaret looked. It was indeed the cat, a scruffy grey creature with a white patch on her chest, sitting on the stone wall of the garden, watching the tower with unblinking yellow eyes. "She found us," Alice breathed, her voice full of wonder. "She found us," Margaret agreed. And she wondered, not for the first time, whether there was more to this castle than stone and shadow and the brittle laughter of courtiers. That evening, as the torches were lit and the corridors filled with the smell of wood smoke, a servant came to the blue door with a tray. On it sat a bowl of hot stew, a hunk of bread, and a small pot of honey. "The king's orders," the servant said, and was gone before Margaret could ask. She looked at the honey, then at Alice, who was already reaching for the bread with both hands. A king who was poisoned did not send honey to a maid's room. A king who trusted no one did not give a child a pot of sweetness with no explanation. Unless, she thought, he was not entirely the Iron King the courtiers whispered about. Unless there was something beneath the cold surface, something small and hidden, like a grey cat with white paws watching from the shadows of the garden. She dipped her finger in the honey, tasted it. Pure, sweet, untainted. And for the first time since the poison was found, she allowed herself to breathe. Whatever William of Ashford was, he was not the man she had feared. And that, she thought, was either the most comforting or the most dangerous thing she had learned in all her years. She did not yet know which. The blue room in the West Tower was small, but it was warm. That was the first thing Margaret noticed when she pushed the heavy oak door open. Warmth, radiating from a hearth that had been lit sometime in the past hour, the flames crackling softly against the chill of the autumn night. A bed stood against one wall, dressed in clean linen and piled with wool blankets. A small table held a loaf of bread, a pot of honey, a jug of steaming soup, and 2 wooden bowls. A stack of firewood sat neatly beside the hearth. Alice stood in the doorway, her eyes wide, her small hand gripping her mother's skirt. She had been quiet since the great hall, quiet through the walk up the winding stairs, quiet through the corridors where servants had stared at them, with a mixture of curiosity and fear. But now she let go of Margaret's skirt, took a step forward, her bare feet padding on the stone floor. "Mama," she breathed, "is this ours?" Margaret did not know how to answer that. She stood in the middle of the room, still holding the small bundle that contained everything they owned. A change of clothes, a worn blanket, Alice's rag doll with the button eyes, the old watch that had belonged to her husband. She had expected to be questioned, perhaps confined to the servants' quarters under guard. She had not expected this. A room with a fire, food on the table, blankets that smelled of lavender. "It is ours for tonight," she said carefully. "Perhaps longer. We shall see." Alice climbed onto the bed, testing it with the cautious wonder of a child who had never slept on anything but a straw pallet. The mattress gave beneath her soft and deep. She bounced once, twice, then stopped, looking up at Margaret with a seriousness that made her look older than her 7 years. "Mama, did the king send this?" "I think he did." "Why?" Margaret sat down the bundle and knelt beside the bed, smoothing her daughter's tangled golden hair. It was a good question. The same question she had been asking herself since the moment they had been led up these stairs. Why would a king who had almost been murdered, a king who trusted no one, send honey and warm soup to a maid and her child? "Perhaps he is grateful," she said. "Or perhaps he wants to keep us close, where he can watch us." Alice frowned. "Is that bad?" "I don't know yet, my love. But we are warm, and we are safe, and we have bread and honey. That is more than many people have tonight." She pressed a kiss to Alice's forehead. "Eat something, then we will sleep." They ate in silence, sitting on the edge of the bed, dipping bread into the soup. It was good soup. Bars, thin and root vegetables, with a hint of herbs that Margaret could not name. The honey was golden and thick, and Alice spread it generously on her bread, eating with the focused joy of a child who had never had such a treat. When the bowls were empty and Alice's eyes were growing heavy, Margaret banked the fire and tucked her daughter into bed. The rag doll, Bramble, Alice called it, a name she had invented when she was 3, was placed carefully under the blanket beside her. "Mama?" Alice's voice was small in the dim room, the firelight casting long shadows on the walls. "I'm here. Will the king be all right? The bad man who put poison in his wine? Will he try again?" Margaret's chest tightened. She had been trying not to think about that. About the faceless man who had poured nightshade into a silver jug. About the fact that he was still out there, somewhere in the castle. Perhaps walking the same corridors she walked every day. "I don't know, my love. But the king has guards now, and he is clever. He will be careful." Alice was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very softly, "I liked him. The king. He didn't yell at me." "No, he didn't. He has sad eyes, Mama, like the painting in the chapel, the one of the man who lost his whole family." Margaret did not know what to say to that. She had seen the king's eyes, too, in the brief moment when he had looked at Alice, dark and deep and terribly alone. She had thought it was the look of a man who had just nearly died. But Alice, with the unerring instinct of a child, had seen something else. "Sleep now," Margaret murmured, stroking her daughter's hair. "We will talk more in the morning." Alice's eyes drifted closed. Margaret sat beside her until her breathing evened out, until the small body relaxed into the deep sleep of childhood, and then she rose and moved to the window. The night was clear and cold, the stars sharp as shards of ice against the black sky. Below the castle courtyard was a maze of moving torchlight. Guards, more guards than she had ever seen on an ordinary night, patrolling the walls and the gates. The kingdom of Ashford was on alert, its king nearly dead, its secrets stirring in the dark. A soft knock at the door made her turn. Elena stood in the doorway, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her face lined with concern. "Maggie," she said quietly, using the name only her closest friends used. "The king has asked for you. He wishes to speak with you in his study when the child is asleep." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "Now? He said when you are ready. There is no rush." Elena stepped into the room, her gaze sweeping over the fire, the empty bowls, the sleeping child. "He has never done this before, you know. Sent a maid to the West Tower, given her a fire and food and blankets. He is a man who does nothing without a reason." "What reason could he have for this?" Elena's expression was unreadable. "I have served this castle for 30 years, Maggie. I have seen kings come and go, and I have learned that William of Ashford does not trust easily. But he is also a man who pays his debts." She paused. "Your daughter saved his life. He will not forget that. Margaret added Alice, sleeping peacefully beneath the wool blankets, her mouth slightly open, her hand curled around Bramble's worn ear. She had never thought of her daughter as a hero. She had only ever seen her as a child who was too brave and too curious and too likely to get into trouble. "Will you stay with her while I go?" she asked. "Of course. Go. I will keep the fire burning." And the door watched. Margaret smoothed her dress, tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, and made her way down the winding stairs. The castle at night was a different place. The corridors dark and shadowed, the torches burning low, the silence broken only by the distant clank of a guard's armor or the scurry of a rat in the walls. She had walked these halls 100 times, but tonight they felt unfamiliar, charged with a tension she could not name. The king's study was in the east wing, a room she had never entered. She paused at the door, raised her hand to knock, and hesitated. What did a king want with a maid at this hour? What could he possibly ask her that could not wait until morning? She knocked. A voice from within, low, flat, unsurprised, said, "Enter." William was standing by the window when she entered, his back to her, his hands clasped behind him. He had changed from the training clothes he had worn earlier. Now he wore a dark tunic, unadorned, and his black hair was still damp from washing. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting long shadows across the room. A half-eaten plate of food sat untouched on the desk, and a stack of papers lay beside it, unread. He did not turn around immediately. For a long moment he simply stood there, looking out at the night. And Margaret had the strange feeling that he was not seeing the stars at all, that he was seeing something else entirely, something far away.
Think, and sigh. Duty. That is what everyone tells me. Duty and honor and loyalty, all spoken like words they have memorized but never felt. He moved away from the window toward the fire and gestured to a chair. "Sit, please. I would speak with you as one person to another, not as a king to a servant." Margaret hesitated. Then, because there was something in his voice that was not a command but a request, she sat. "Your daughter," he said, "Alice. She told me she was chasing a cat, a gray cat with white paws. Is that true?" "Yes, Your Majesty. She has always loved cats. There is one that lives in the garden. She has been trying to befriend it for weeks, and it led her to the cellar. So she says. She followed it through a window in the old kitchen, and it ran down the stairs into the wine stores. She was trying to catch it when she saw the man." William was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. "She is very young to be so brave. Most children would have run away, or hidden, or said nothing." "She is very young," Margaret agreed. "But she has never known how to be anything but honest. It is her greatest gift and her greatest danger." He looked at her then, a long, appraising look that made her feel as though he were reading something written on her face. "And you? Were you ever like her?" The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth, closed it, and considered. "I was," she said slowly. "A long time ago, before I learned that honesty can cost you more than you are willing to pay." Something flickered in his eyes, recognition perhaps, or the ghost of it. "And what did it cost you?" Margaret thought of her husband, his laugh, his rough hands, the way he had kissed her forehead before he rode north with the king's army. She thought of the letter that had come 3 weeks later, the one that said he had died bravely, the one that did not say how or where or why. "Everything," she said quietly. "It cost me everything." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. William did not look away, did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply stood there, letting the weight of her words settle between them. "I am sorry," he said at last, "for your loss. I know what it is to lose someone." Margaret looked up, surprised by the softness in his voice. "Your Majesty." "My mother died when I was 7, he said, the words coming out flat and matter-of-fact, as though he had said them 100 times and they had long since lost their sting. "My father did not speak of her. He did not allow anyone to speak of her. It was as though she had never existed." He paused, and for a moment Margaret saw something raw in his face, a grief so old and so buried that it had become part of the stone of him. "That is why I asked you here," he said. Not to question you and not to thank you, though I do thank you. I asked you here because your daughter reminded me of something I had forgotten. What it is like to be unafraid. What it is like to speak the truth without calculating the cost." Margaret did not know what to say. She sat in the chair, her hands folded in her lap, and looked at the man before her. Not the Iron King, not the cold ruler, but a man who had been 7 years old once, who had lost his mother and learned that grief was a thing to be hidden. "Your Majesty," she said finally, "I am just a maid. I clean rooms and mend clothes and raise my daughter. I do not have wisdom to offer a king." "You have honesty," he said. "That is rarer than wisdom." He moved to the desk and picked up a small leather pole, thick, worn and soft from years of handling. "I have something for you, a token of my gratitude. It is not much, but I thought you might like it." He held it out to her. Margaret took it, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest moment. Warm, calloused, solid. She opened the pouch and found a silver coin, old and worn, stamped with the stad of House Ashford. "It is not the coin itself," William said, "but what it represents, a promise. As long as I am King of Ashford, you and your daughter will have a place here. You will be safe, you will be fed, you will be protected." Margaret looked up at him, and for the first time since she had entered the room, she saw not the king, but the man. The lonely, guarded, deeply wounded man who had spent his whole life building walls to keep everyone out. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she whispered. He nodded, and the moment passed. The walls were back in place, his face smooth and unreadable. "You should return to your daughter," he said. "She will wake soon, and she will want her mother. Children always do." Margaret rose, tucking the pouch into her pocket. She paused at the door, one hand on the latch, and looked back at him. He had turned to the fire again, his shoulders bowed, his silhouette dark against the flames. "Your Majesty," she said, "if you ever need someone to speak to, someone who is not a courtier or a guard or a servant who fears you, I'm in the West Tower. Alice and I are not going anywhere." He did not turn around, but she saw his shoulders tense, and after a long moment he said, "Thank you, Mistress Margaret." She closed the door softly behind her and walked back through the dark corridors, her hand in her pocket, her fingers closed around the silver coin. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the window. And cobbling, thinking with a Jane de Second comedy, and somewhere in the castle a dog barked. But Margaret did not feel the cold. She felt, for the first time in a long time, something like hope. When she reached the blue room, Elena was sitting by the fire, mending a tear in Alice's dress. The child was still asleep, her face peaceful, her hand still curled around the rag doll. "Well?" Elena asked, looking up. Margaret sat down on the edge of the bed and pulled the coin from her pocket, turning it over in her fingers. The stag caught the firelight, gleaming silver against the dark. "He gave me this," she said. "He said we are safe here, that we have a place in the castle as long as he is king." Elena's eyebrows rose. William of Ashford made a promise to a maid and her child? It seems so. Elena was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, a rare, warm smile that softened the lines of her face. "I told you, Maggie. He pays his debts." She returned to her mending, her needle moving in quick, sure stitches. "And I think, perhaps, he has begun to remember what it is like to have something worth protecting." Margaret looked at Alice, sleeping peacefully in the warm room, the fire crackling, the bread and honey gone, the silver coin heavy in her hand. Outside, the wind howled around the tower, and somewhere in the dark, a man who had tried to kill a king was still free. But for now, in this small blue room, with her daughter safe and a promise made, Margaret allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, things might be all right after all. She blew out the candle, lay down beside Alice, and let the warmth of the fire and the weight of the coin lull her into a sleep deeper than any she had known in years. The third night after the poisoning, Margaret could not sleep. It was not the wind, though the wind had been howling around the west tower like a wounded beast for hours. It was not the cold, though. The autumn chill had crept through the stone walls and settled into the bones of the castle like an unwelcome guest. It was the restlessness of a woman who had spent her life serving others, and who now found herself unable to serve anyone at all. She had been given a room, a real room, not a curtained alcove in the servants' quarters. It was small, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the courtyard. Elena had seen to it personally, muttering something about the king's orders and proper accommodation for the child. The room was warm, the fire banked, the blankets thick, and yet Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her hands folded over the silver coin that hung on a leather cord around her neck. Beside her, Alice slept with the abandon of a child who had no idea how close they had come to death. Her golden hair fanned across the pillow, her small mouth slightly open, one hand clutching a smooth gray stone she had found to the courtyard that afternoon. "Pretty," she had declared, pressing it into her mother's palm. "For luck, Mama." Margaret smiled at the memory and turned over, willing herself to sleep. But her mind would not quiet. She kept seeing the king's face as he stood in the great hall, the torchlight carving shadows into his features. She kept hearing his voice, low and rough, telling her about a mother who had died too young, a father who had forbidden her name to be spoken. She kept thinking about the way he had looked at Alice, like a man who had forgotten what it was to be looked at without fear. With a soft sigh, Margaret sat up. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, padded to the window, and looked out. The court outside below was silver with moonlight, the stones slick with the damp of autumn. A few torches burned in iron brackets, their flames bending in the wind. In the east tower, one window glowed with a pale, steady light, the king's study. He was still awake. It was past midnight, and he was still awake. Margaret turned away from the window. She reached for her work basket, the one Elena had sent up with a note that read, "Thought you might want these. E." Inside, neatly coiled, were threads of every color, a bone needle case, a small pair of shears and a thimble that had once belonged to her own mother. She had been looking for work to occupy her hands, and now, without quite deciding to, she found herself pulling on her woolen shawl, picking up the basket, and slipping out of the room. The corridors were quiet. The castle at night was a different creature than the castle by day, softer, darker, full of small sounds that the bustle of servants and guards usually drowned out. The wind breathed through the arrow slits. A rat scrabbled somewhere in the walls. Somewhere far below, a door banged shut, and Margaret's heart jumped. She told herself she was not going to the king's study. She was simply walking to clear her head, to tire herself enough to sleep. But her feet, as if they had a mind of their own, carried her up the east tower stairs, past the landing with the faded tapestry, to the heavy oak door at the top. And there she stopped. The door was ajar, just a crack. Through it, she could see the edge of a desk, a stack of parchment, a guttering candle, and she could hear, faintly, the scratch of a quill, the rustle of a page being turned. Margaret stood in the shadows, her heart beating a little too fast. She should not be here. She had no reason to be here. If a guard found her lurking outside the king's study at this hour, even the silver coin around her neck might not save her. But then she saw it. On a small table outside the study door, where servants placed trays for the king's meals, sat a covered dish. The food was untouched, a bowl of soup grown cold, a crust of bread hardening, a small pot of honey still sealed. The king had not eaten. Again. Margaret's mouth tightened. She had spent years watching men who forgot to eat, men who worked themselves to the bone until they collapsed. Her own husband had been like that in the weeks before he marched north. She would bring him bread and cheese at his workbench, and he would smile at her, and promise to eat it later, and she would find it still there the next morning, untouched. She knew what hunger looked like in a man's eyes, and it was not the hunger for food. On impulse, she reached for the cold tray. The soup had congealed into a thick film. The bread was hard as stone. She would take it away, she told herself. She would bring something fresh, something warm. She was halfway down the stairs before she realized what she was doing. The kitchen was dark, but Margaret knew it as well as she knew the lines of her own palm. She found the hearth still smoldering, a pot of thick stew hanging over the embers. She ladled some into a clean bowl, cut a thick slice of bread,
and added a small dish of honey, the good honey, the one from the southern hives that the cook hoarded for special occasions. She carried the tray back up the stairs, her arms trembling slightly from the weight, her breath fogging in the cold air. And when she reached the study door again, she stopped. The door was still ajar, the candle still burned. But now she could hear something else. A low, rough voice speaking in a language she did not know. Ancient words, perhaps, or a prayer, or a name. Margaret stood very still. She did not mean to listen. She only meant to leave the tray and go. But the voice was not commanding. It was not the voice of a king. It was the voice of a man who thought he was alone, and so had allowed himself to be honest. She set the tray down as quietly as she could. She had turned to leave when she noticed it. A cloak. A heavy, deep gray wool cloak, draped over a chair near the door. The lining was torn. A long seam had given way along the left shoulder, the dark silk gaping open like a wound. It was the kind of tear that would only grow worse, that would let in the cold wind on a long ride, that would be noticed by no one because the king had no one to notice such things for him. Margaret did not think. She did not weigh the consequences. She simply picked up the cloak, sat down on the cold stone floor outside the study door, and took out her needle and thread. The deep gray thread matched almost perfectly. She had chosen it the day after the poisoning, without quite knowing why. She had told herself it was for mending, that a good servant kept a stock of all colors, but in truth, she had chosen that thread because she had noticed the king's cloak hanging in the antechamber, and she had seen the tear. She sewed slowly, carefully, her fingers working by touch in the dim light of the single torch that burned at the end of the corridor. Each stitch was small and even. Each knot was pulled tight and hidden. It was a simple task, mending a cloak, and yet it felt like something more, like a message she could not put into words. She was so intent on her work that she did not hear the door open. She did not see the tall shadow fall across the floor. She did not notice the king standing in the doorway, his quill still in his hand, his deep blue eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not read. It was only when he cleared his throat, a small, deliberate sound, that Margaret looked up, her breath caught, the needle slipped, pricking her finger. A bead of blood welled up and she pressed it to her lips, her face flooding with heat. "Your Majesty, I am sorry. I did not mean to. I was just—" "You were mending my cloak?" William said. His voice was quiet, almost wondering. He glanced toward the window, where the moon had climbed past its zenith, past the second hour of the night. Margaret scrambled to her feet, the cloak falling from her lap. "I could not sleep, and I saw the tear. It is a simple thing, Your Majesty. Anyone could have done it. I only thought, the nights are cold, and if the tear is left, the wind will find its way in, and you will be cold, and I—" She was babbling. She knew she was babbling. She closed her mouth, looked down at her hands, and waited for the wrath she was certain would come. But William did not speak. He looked at her hands, at the needle still clutched between her fingers, at the neat line of stitches that had already closed half the tear. Anyone could have done it, he repeated slowly. Yes, anyone could have, but no one did. Margaret did not know what to say to that. She stood there, her heart thumping, her finger still stinging where she had pricked it. William stepped aside, holding the door open. "Come in. You will catch your death out here." She should have refused. She should have curtsied and fled. But the warmth of the room beckoned, and the king was looking at her not with suspicion, but with something that might have been confusio. Think, Anne, or curiosity, or— She dared not name it. She stepped inside. The study was smaller than she had expected. The desk was cluttered with papers, a half-finished letter, a map of the Northern Territories weighted down with a dagger. The fire had burned low, leaving only glowing coals, and on a small table near the window, Margaret saw the tray she had left, the stew, the bread, the honey. She had not known he would see it. She had not meant for him to see it. And yet, there it was. And he had noticed it. and he had brought it inside. "You left this," William said, gesturing to the tray. "The stew is good. I ate some." Margaret's eyes widened. You ate it?" "It was warm." He said it simply, as if that explained everything. I had forgotten what warm food tastes like. Something twisted in Margaret's chest, a sharp aching thing that she could not name. She looked at the King of Ashford, this tall, cold man who ruled a kingdom, and yet had forgotten what warm food tasted like. She looked at his cloak, still in her hands, the tear half mended. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, "when was the last time someone made you a meal?" William was silent for a long moment. He looked at her, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, something old and guarded, something that had not been looked at in a very long time. "I do not remember," he said at last. "I think it was my mother, before she died." The words hung in the air between them. Margaret felt the weight of them, the raw honesty of a man who had not meant to say so much. "Then I am glad you ate it," she said. "And if you would like, I will bring you something warm. Tomorrow, and the day after that, if it is not an impertinence." William looked at her for a long, searching moment. Then slowly the corner of his mouth the barest ghost of a smile there and gone. "That would not be an impertinence," he said. "That would be—" He paused, searching for a word. "That would be kindness." He said the word as if it were foreign to him, as if he were testing the shape of it in his mouth. Margaret curtsied, cradling the cloak against her chest. "Then I will bring it, Your Majesty, and I will finish the mending by morning." She turned to leave. She was at the door when his voice stopped her. "Mistress Margaret." She looked back. He was standing by the fire, the embers casting a warm glow across his face. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, spoken quietly, without ceremony, and yet they landed in Margaret's chest like a struck bell, echoing through every hollow space. She nodded, unable to speak, and slipped out of the room. The corridor was cold. The torch had burned down to a stub, and on the floor, just outside the study door, Margaret found a small dish, a honey cake still warm, wrapped in a clean cloth. Beside it lay a smooth grey stone, identical to the one Alice had found in the courtyard. Margaret knelt down and picked up the stone. It was warm, as if someone had held it for a long time. She looked around, but the corridor was empty. Somewhere below, a door closed softly. A small, barefoot figure in a patched nightgown hurried back toward the west tower, a scrap of honey cake in her hand and a satisfied smile on her face. "Mamma will be so pleased," Alice whispered to herself, tucking the hem of her nightgown into her mouth to keep from giggling. "The king liked my cake. I saw him eat it. I peeked through the crack in the door and he ate it and he smiled. He smiled, Mamma. The king smiled." She did not know that her mother had seen the king smile too. She did not know that a Sikh tank had been mended. A tray of stew had been eaten, and 2 words had passed between 2 lonely people in the middle of the night, words that meant nothing to anyone else and everything to them. But the castle knew. The ancient stones, the whispering wind, the embers in the study fire, they all knew that something had shifted that night in the small hours before dawn. The King of Ashford had eaten warm food, he had accepted kindness. And in the morning, when he found his cloak neatly full outside his study door, the tear mended with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, he would press his thumb to the seam and stand very still for a long, long time. And in the West Tower, a little girl would wake to find a silver coin on her pillow, a coin she had not had the night before, stamped with the crest of the Stag of Ashford. "Mamma," she would say, holding it up in the pale morning light, "did you put this here?" And Margaret, who had not slept but felt more rested than she had in years, would smile and say, "Perhaps the king left it. For the honey cake?" Alice's eyes would go wide. "The king? For me?" "For you," Margaret would say, and she would reach out and smooth her daughter's hair and feel, for the first time in a very long time, that perhaps this cold, dark castle held more warmth than she had ever imagined. The night was over. The morning had come. And somewhere in the East Tower, a king who had forgotten what kindness tasted like pressed his thumb to a seam of neat stitches and thought about a maid with gray-green eyes, a child with a honey cake, and the strange, impossible warmth of being cared for.
The old watch had belonged to Daniel Ashworth, Margaret's late husband, a soldier of the northern garrison who had died 4 years ago in the Battle of
Thornwood Pass. It was a heavy, silver-cased thing, worn smooth at the edges by years of thumbing, its face cracked across one corner, its hands frozen at 1/4 past the hour. Daniel had wound it every morning without fail, even when it no longer kept time, even when the hour it showed was always wrong. Margaret kept it wrapped in a scrap of linen at the bottom of her wooden chest. She did not wind it. She did not look at it often, but she knew it was there, and that was enough. On the 3rd morning after the poison, the morning after the honey cakes and the silver coin, she carried the chest down to the washroom to air out its contents. The autumn damp had crept into everything, and the woolen blankets smelled of mildew. She had spread them over the drying racks, her hands busy with the familiar work, when Alice came running in with a stray kitten she had found in the stable. "Mama, look! He has only one ear, and he purrs like a little drum." "Alice, put that creature down. You will track fleas into the linens." The kitten squirmed. Alice giggled and spun in a circle, and her elbow caught the edge of the wooden chest. It tipped. The contents spilled across the stone floor: folded shifts, a worn prayer book, a lock of baby hair tied with red thread, and the linen-wrapped bundle that tumbled out and came apart, sending the old silver watch skittering across the flagstones. It struck the leg of the iron wash-basin with a sharp, sickening crack. Alice went very still. The kitten wriggled free and darted under the drying rack. Margaret knelt down slowly, her hands moving as if through water, and picked up the watch. The glass face, already cracked, had shattered entirely. The silver casing was dented at the corner. The hands, frozen at 1/4 past the hour for 4 years now, hung loose and useless, one of them bent at an unnatural angle. "Oh," Alice whispered, her voice small and horrified. "Oh, Mama, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Margaret did not answer. She could not. The watch had been Daniel's. It had been his father's before that. It had ticked on his wrist through the northern campaigns, through the cold nights in the garrisons, through the last letter he had written her. A letter she still kept folded in the same chest, its ink faded to pale brown, its words worn soft at the creases. She had not cried when the messenger brought the news. She had not cried at the funeral where the priest spoke of honor and glory and a soldier's death. She had saved her tears for the dark hours of the night, when Alice was asleep and the castle was quiet, and even then she had wept silently, into the pillow, so that no one would hear. Now she sat on the cold floor of the washroom, holding the broken watch in her hands, and felt something inside her chest crack along the same fault lines. "Mama," Alice's voice was trembling. "Mama, I can fix it. I'll ask the tinker, or the—" "It's all right," Margaret said, though her voice came out rough. "It's all right, love. It was an accident." But it was not all right. She wrapped the watch back in the linen, her fingers clumsy with a grief she had thought was safely buried. And she did not look at her daughter's face, because she knew if she did, she would cry, and she had promised herself she would never let Alice see her cry over Daniel. She kept that promise. She held it together through the morning, through the laundry, through the midday meal. She held it together when Alice, quiet and subdued, sat beside her at the table and pushed her food around her plate without eating. She held it together until the afternoon, when Elena found her in a corner of the drying yard, staring at the linen-wrapped bundle in her hands. "What's that?" Elena asked, settling her bulk onto the bench beside her. "My husband's watch. Alice knocked it off the chest this morning. It's broken." Elena was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Let me see it." Margaret hesitated, then unwrapped the watch and held it out. Elena turned it over in her hands, her thick fingers surprisingly gentle as they traced the dented casing and the shattered face. "It's a good piece," she said. "Old silver, solid work. The innards might be sound, even if the face is gone." "Do you know who could mend it?" Margaret shook her head. "Daniel said it came from his grandfather. There was a clockmaker in the town below the castle, but he died years ago, and I don't know anyone else who works with such things." Elena was silent again. She turned the watch over once more, then handed it back to Margaret with a decisive nod. "Leave it with me," she said. "I know a man." That evening, after the supper dishes were cleared and Alice had been put to bed, still subdued, still apologetic, still pressing her face into her mother's shoulder and whispering, "I'm sorry, Mama, I'm sorry," until she fell asleep, Margaret sat alone in her narrow room, the broken watch in her hands, and let herself grieve. It was the first time in 4 years she had allowed it.
Not the sharp, tearing grief of the first months, but something quieter, deeper, like a wound that had healed over on the surface but still ached in the bone when the weather turned. She remembered Daniel's laugh, loud and unguarded. She remembered the way he had swung Alice up onto his shoulders when she was a baby, the way he had called her, "my little sparrow." She remembered the last morning, the last kiss, the last time he had said her name. She did not cry. She had made herself stop crying years ago, but she sat in the dark with the watch in her hands until the candle burned down to a stub, and she felt the weight of 4 years of held-back tears pressing against the inside of her chest. She did not sleep well that night. The next morning, a servant came to her door with a small wooden box. Margaret opened it with trembling hands, expecting— she did not know what she expected. Perhaps the watch, returned unrepaired, a polite refusal. Perhaps a message that it was beyond saving. Instead, she found the watch. It had been cleaned. The dent in the casing had been carefully hammered out, smooth as new. The shattered face had been replaced with a fresh piece of glass, clear and unblemished. The bent hand had been straightened, and when she lifted it, half afraid to hope, she saw the hands, no longer frozen at 1/4 past the hour, but moving, slowly, steadily, ticking away the seconds as if the 4 years of stillness had never happened. There was a scrap of paper folded beneath the watch. Margaret unfolded it with fingers that would not stop shaking. A soldier's watch deserves a second chance. The handwriting was firm, angular, the hand of a man who wrote rarely and carefully. There was no signature, no seal, no name, but Margaret knew. She knew the way she knew the feel of Daniel's watch in her palm, the way she knew the weight of the castle's silence at midnight. She pressed the paper to her lips, and then, because she was alone and no one could see, she pressed it to her heart. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty room. "Oh, thank you." She did not ask how Elena had arranged it. She did not ask who had done the work, or how it had been done so quickly. Some questions, she had learned, were better left unasked, but that evening, when she passed through the east corridor on her way to the linen store, she paused at the door of the king's study. The door was closed. A thin line of candlelight showed beneath it. She could hear the scratch of a pen, the restless movement of a man who did not sit still easily. Margaret raised her hand. She stood there for a long moment, her knuckles inches from the wood. Then she lowered her hand, pressed her palm flat against the door, and said quietly, so that only the wood could hear, "Thank you, Your Majesty." She did not wait for an answer. She turned and walked away, the watch ticking gently against her chest, where she had tucked it into the pocket over her heart. But if she had waited, she would have seen the door open a crack. She would have seen a tall man in a dark tunic stand in the gap, watching her retreating figure, his blue eyes unreadable. She would have seen him raise a hand, as if to call her back, and then lower it and close the door and return to his chair by the fire. He did not sleep well that night either, but for a different reason. The next day, Alice found another silver coin on her pillow. "Mama," she said, holding it up to the light, "the king's magic is working again." Margaret smiled and smoothed her daughter's hair and did not tell her that it was not magic at all. She did not tell her that the old watch was ticking again, that it sat in the pocket over her heart like a second heartbeat. She did not tell her that she had spoken a thank you to a closed door and that she had felt, for just a moment, that the door had heard her. Instead, she said, "Perhaps it is. Perhaps the king is kinder than he lets on." A bee, too, things considered this, with the gravity of a child who had seen a king almost die. "I think," she said slowly, "he just needs someone to remind him." Margaret looked down at her daughter. "Remind him of what?" "Remind him that he's a person?" Alice said simply. "Like us." The words settled into Margaret's chest like a stone into still water. She opened her mouth to answer and found she had no words. So she kissed her daughter's forehead instead and held her close and felt the watch tick against her heart. That evening,
As she walked through the castle garden on her way back from the kitchens, she paused beneath the bare branches of the old apple tree. The sky was clear, the stars sharp and cold, the first frost glittering on the grass. She drew the watch from her pocket and held it up, letting the moonlight catch the clean glass face. The hands had moved. She had wound it that morning the way Daniel used to, and it had kept time all day. She pressed it to her lips, then tucked it away, and as she turned to walk back toward the castle, she looked up at the east tower, where a light still burned in a narrow window, and she nodded. Just once. Just a small, quiet nod. Somewhere above her, a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be thanked stood at his window and watched her walk back inside. He did not nod, he did not smile, but he pressed his thumb to the seam of neat stitches on his sleeve, and he thought about a maid with gray-green eyes, and a watch that had been given a second chance, and the strange, impossible feeling of being remembered. The storm came down from the north without warning, the way winter always did in the high country. 1 hour, the sky was pale and clear. The next, a wall of gray-white cloud rolled over the peaks and buried the castle in a hoof-wearing torrent of snow. The wind screamed through the narrow windows, rattling the shutters, driving ice against the stones. By the 3rd hour, the courtyard was knee-deep in white, and the guards had been ordered inside for their own safety. Margaret had been in the west wing all afternoon, mending a torn bolster for the guest chambers, when the first blast of cold air sent the tapestries billowing. She crossed to the window and looked out at the roiling sky, her stomach tightening with unease. "Alice," she called, "where are you?" "Here, Mama." The child's voice came from the corner, where she had been building a tower out of kindling sticks. "It's getting dark. Is it night already?" "Not yet. The storm is blocking the sun." Margaret pulled the shutters closed and latched them. The room was small but warm, the fireplace well stocked, and she had enough bread and cheese to last them a day or two if needed. She was calculating how long the wood would last when a heavy knock sounded at the door. She opened it to find a guard, snow crusted on his shoulders and helmet, his face red with cold. "Mistress Margaret, His Majesty is here. He was inspecting the outer wall when the storm broke, and the east stair is blocked. We've brought him to the west wing for shelter." Margaret's heart gave a strange, uneven thump. "Here? There is no other safe room in this corridor." The guard stepped aside, and there he was. William, the Iron King of Ashford, shaking snow from his cloak, his dark hair wet and plastered to his forehead, his cheeks flushed with cold. He looked up, met her eyes, and something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or the same uneasy recognition that she felt. "Mistress Margaret," he said, "it seems the storm and I have arrived uninvited." Margaret Seavey tacked back, pulling the door wider. "Your Majesty, please, come in. The fire is small, but it's warm." He hesitated, just a breath, and then he stepped inside. The guard saluted and disappeared back into the howling white, sealing the door behind him. The room suddenly felt much smaller, much warmer, much more alive. Alice had frozen by the fireplace, kindling tower forgotten, her blue eyes round and fixed on the king. "Hello," she said, very small. William looked at her. "Hello, Alice of the West Wing. You're all snowy," she said it, with the blunt honesty of a 7-year-old, and Margaret's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Alice?" But William only smiled. Actually smiled. A real one, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "I am. I walked from the East Tower, and the snow did not care for my rank." Alice considered this, then nodded gravely. "Snow doesn't care about anything. It just falls." "That is the truest thing anyone has said to me all winter." He crossed to the fire, but stopped at a careful distance from it, holding out his hands to the warmth without stepping closer. Margaret noticed it, the way he stood just at the edge of the fire's reach, never letting the flames get too near. She did not say anything. She simply took the kettle from the hearth and set about making tea, busying her hands so she would not have to think about why a king might fear his own hearth fire. The wind howled outside, shaking the walls. Snow rattled against the shutters like handfuls of gravel. The fire crackled and popped, casting long shadows across the small room.
Alice, who had been watching William with the intense scrutiny of a child who has decided to figure something out, spoke up.
Are you scared of the storm?
William did not answer right away. He looked at the child,
Of earnest face, her steady gaze, and something in his expression softened. No, he said. I have been through worse storms. In the mountains, the wind can strip a man's cloak from his back and leave him frozen in a single night. This is a castle, and the walls are thick. We are safe. Alice nodded, as if this were a satisfactory answer, and then she asked the question Margaret had been dreading. Are you scared of anything? The room went very quiet. Margaret's hands stilled on the teapot. She did not turn around, but she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them, all the way the snow was pressing down on the roof above. William was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost surprised, as if he had not expected to say the words out loud. Yes, he said. I am scared of being forgotten. Alice frowned. But you're the king. Everyone knows you. There is a difference between being known and being remembered. He said it simply, without self-pity, the way a man states a fact about the weather. People know the king. They do not know William. Margaret turned, the teacup warm in her hands, and found him looking at her. There was something open in his face, something unguarded, and she realized with a jolt that he had not said these words to anyone in a very long time, perhaps ever. She handed him the cup. He took it, their fingers brushing briefly, and she felt the shock of it travel up her arm like lightning along a wire. Tell me a story, Alice said suddenly, plopping herself down on the hearth rug with the confidence of a child who has decided that the king is just a person after all. Mama tells me stories when the storm is loud. It makes the wind seem smaller. William looked at her, then at Margaret, who shrugged helplessly.
He has a point, Your Majesty. The storm does seem smaller when there is a story in the air. He lowered himself onto the edge of the settle, still keeping his careful distance from the fire, and thought for a moment. When I was a boy, he said, my mother used to tell me a story about the stars. Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. It was the first time she had heard him speak of his mother, the first time she had heard him speak of anyone from his past, really, beyond the clipped, practical words of a commander. She said that every star in the sky is a soul that was loved too much to leave forever. They go up there, she said, so they can watch over the people they left behind. And on winter nights, when the air is clear and the stars are bright, they come as close as they can to keep the ones they love warm. Alice's eyes had gone wide and soft. Is your mama a star now? William's jaw tightened just a fraction. Margaret saw it. She saw the way his hand curled around the teacup, the way his gaze dropped to the fire. Not to the flames, but to the stones of the hearth, as if he were looking through them to something else. Yes, he said quietly. She is. Alice nodded, very seriously, and then she did something that made Margaret's heart stop. She got up, crossed the room, and climbed onto the settle beside William. She leaned her small head against his arm and said very matter-of-factly, My papa is a star too. Mama says he watches us every night, so we have 2 stars watching us tonight. That's good luck. William went completely still. The teacup was frozen halfway to his lips. Margaret could see the muscles of his throat working, the way he swallowed hard, the way his free hand, the one not holding the cup, curled against his knee. Your father? He said, his voice rough. He was a soldier. Daniel Ashworth, Margaret said softly. He died at Thornwood Pass 4 years ago. William closed his eyes. For a moment the only sound in the room was the wind and the crackling fire. When he opened them again, they were bright. Too bright, and he blinked hard. Thornwood Pass, he repeated. I read his name in the rolls. He was a good soldier. Honorable. Marguerite felt her own throat tighten. Thank you, Your Majesty. He would have been proud to hear you say that. Alice, who had been watching the exchange with the quiet attention of a child who understands more than she lets on, tugged at William's sleeve. You're sad, she said. I can tell. When I'm sad, Mama holds my hand. Do you want me to hold your hand? William looked down at the small hand on his sleeve, the tiny fingers, the chipped nail on the thumb, the scrape on the knuckle from a fall in the courtyard. He looked at it for a long, long moment. Then he took her hand in his. His hand was huge, scarred, calloused from sword and rains and hard winters. Her hand was a small, warm bird in his palm. "Yes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I think I would like that." Margaret stood at the table, the teapot forgotten, watching her daughter hold the hand of the Iron King of Ashford, and she felt something crack open in her chest. Something she had kept carefully sealed since the day she had buried Daniel in the frozen ground of the Thornwood foothills. She turned away, pretending to stir the fire, and pressed her knuckles to her mouth until the burning behind her eyes subsided. The storm raged on outside. The wind screamed and the snow piled higher against the walls, but in the small West Wing room there was warmth, the kind that comes from a fire and a story, and a hand held in the dark. Alice fell asleep an hour later, her head on William's shoulder, her small hand still loosely curled around his. He had not moved. He had not pulled away. "He is good," Margaret said quietly, watching them. "He was always good. The world just didn't give him many chances to show it." William did not look at her. His voice was low, rough, barely audible over the wind. "Your daughter told me, on the night of the warning, that I only needed someone to remind me I was a person." Margaret smiled, a small, sad smile. She has a way of seeing things others miss. She has a way of seeing the king and finding the man underneath. He paused, and she felt the weight of his next words before he spoke them. "It has been a very long time since anyone looked at me that way." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. The wind howled, and Margaret crossed the room, slowly, carefully, and sat down on the settle on the other side of Alice, close enough that her shoulder was a hand's breadth from his. "The storm will pass," she said. "It always does." "In the mountains," William said, "the storms can last for a week. The passes will be blocked. We may be snowed in for days." There was something in his voice that was not quite regret, something lighter, almost wondering, as if the thought of being snowed in with a maid and her daughter was not an inconvenience, but a gift he had not expected to receive. Margaret felt her lips curve into a smile. "Then we will need more stories, Your Majesty. Alice will be disappointed if she wakes up and discovers she has missed the rest of the stars." William looked down at the sleeping child, the golden hair spread across his arm, the small hand still curled around his fingers. Something in his face had changed. The Holman think lines softened, the suspicion muted. "She won't miss them," he said quietly. "I'll be here when she wakes. I'll tell her the rest." Margaret's breath caught. It was such a small thing, a promise to a sleeping child, but the weight of it pressed against her ribs, warm and unexpected. "You're staying, then?" "The storm has decided for me." He glanced at her, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "I never argue with the mountains." She laughed, a real laugh, startled out of her, bright in the small room. William's smile widened just a fraction, and for a moment he looked younger, lighter, like a man who had forgotten how to do this and was remembering it one breath at a time. The wind gusted against the shutters, the fire crackled. Alice slept on, her small chest rising and falling, her hands still tangled with the king's. And in the small West Wing room, in the heart of the storm, two people who had been lonely for a very long time sat close together in the firelight, not quite touching, not quite apart, and let the silence settle around them like a blanket. Morning would come, and with it the snow, and the responsibility of a kingdom waiting to be led. But for now there was only this, a fire, a sleeping child, and the quiet, impossible warmth of two hearts beginning to thaw. Morning came to Ashford Castle wrapped in a silence so complete that it seemed the world had been muffled in wool. The storm had passed, leaving behind drifts that reached the windowsills of the West Wing, and a hush that made every voice seem too loud. Margaret woke to cold air and the smell of wood smoke. Alice was still asleep on the pallet by the fire, her golden hair spread across the pillow, one small hand clutching the edge of her blanket. For a moment, everything was ordinary, the familiar think on her shoulders, the sound of wind rattling the shutters, the knowledge that there was work to be done. Then she remembered the night before, the firelight,
the king's voice low and rough with disuse, telling Alice a story about a star that fell in love with a shepherd. The way he had looked at her when Alice finally drifted off, uncertain, almost vulnerable, as if he had shown her something he had never shown anyone. She pressed her hands to her cheeks. They were warm. The whole room felt warm. By the time she dressed and braided her hair, the castle was stirring. Servants moved through the corridors with shovels and brooms, clearing paths through the snow. A boy ran past with an armload of firewood. Margaret caught herself smiling at nothing, and forced her face into its usual calm lines. She was on her way to the laundry when she noticed it, the way the other servants fell silent as she passed. The cook, who usually greeted her with a nod, turned abruptly to the stove. 2 kitchen maids whispered behind their hands, their eyes following her down the corridor. Margaret told her that was nothing. The castle was always full of whispers. She was a maid from the West Wing, nobody of consequence. There was no reason for anyone to look at her with that particular shade of wariness, but the whispers followed her all morning, like a cold draught she could not escape. It was Elena who finally told her the truth. The housekeeper found her in the linen room, folding sheets with hands that had begun to tremble without her permission. Elena closed the door behind her, her round face unusually grave. "Maggie," she said, "there is something you need to know, and I will tell you straight, because you deserve better than to hear it from the tongues that are wagging in the
Kitching, Margaret set down the sheet. "Tell me, they found something." Elena's voice dropped. "In your quarters. A small vial, hidden in the lining of your sewing basket. The physician says it held nightshade, the same poison that was in the king's wine." The words did not make sense at first. They hung in the air like a foreign language, familiar sounds arranged in an order that meant nothing. "In my sewing basket?" Margaret repeated. "That is not possible. I do not even know what nightshade looks like. Elena, you know me. You know I would never." "I know." Elena took her hands, squeezing them hard. "And the king knows. That is why you are still standing here, and not in the dungeons. But Lord Cedric has been asking questions, Maggie. Loud questions. And there are those who are all too ready to believe that the maid who saved the king's life was part of the plot to take it." The bottom dropped out of Margaret's stomach. Lord Cedric. The king's most trusted advisor. The man who had stood beside William at every council meeting for the past decade. He had been the one to order the search of the servants' quarters. He had been the one to find the vial. And the king? Her voice came out thin, smaller than she intended. "What does he believe?" Elena's face softened. He looked at the vial for a long time. Then he looked at Lord Cedric, and he said, "This proves nothing. The child warned me. The mother has no reason to save me and then poison me." And he walked out before anyone could argue. Something loosened in Margaret's chest, a knot she had not realized she was carrying. "He believes me," she whispered. "For now," Elena said heavily. "But Cedric is not finished. And the king, for all his strength, cannot protect you from every tongue in this castle." "The move him. Think I want to do my heart, but I'm so cloaked." "Think he's telling our Maggie, you must watch your step." The warning came too late. That afternoon, as Margaret was carrying a basket of clean linens through the great hall, she was stopped by 2 guards in the king's colors. Their faces were blank, formal, giving nothing away. "Mistress Margaret," the first one said, "by order of Lord Cedric, you are to be confined to the West Wing until further inquiry is made into the matter of the poison." Margaret's grip tightened on the basket. "And the king? Does he know of this order?" The guard hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but long enough for her to see the truth. "Lord Cedric acts with the king's authority in matters of security, mistress. The order stands." She wanted to argue. She wanted to demand to see William, to look him in the eye and ask him if he truly believed her capable of such a thing. But she had learned long ago that arguing with guards was like arguing with the weather. It changed nothing and only exhausted her. "May I at least see my daughter?" she asked, her voice steady. "She has been moved to the servants' quarters under the care of Mistress Elena. She is safe." Margaret nodded. She did not trust herself to speak. She set down the basket, turned, and walked toward the West Wing, her back straight, her steps measured, her heart a cold stone in her chest. The West Wing was quiet. The fire in her room had burned low, and the afternoon light through the narrow window was gray and thin. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, and tried to think. Someone had put that vial in her sewing basket. Someone who knew her habits, her movements, her absence from her room. Someone who wanted her blamed for a crime she had not committed, or worse, wanted to silence the only witness to
Think true culprits work, Alice. The thought struck her like a blow. Alice had seen the man in the cellar. Alice could identify him. And if the poisoner knew that, if he knew that a child held the key to his identity— Margaret was on her feet before she finished the thought, her heart hammering. She had to get to Alice. She had to make sure her daughter was safe. She had to find William, to make him understand. The door opened. William stood in the doorway, snow still dusting his shoulders, his dark cloak thrown carelessly over one arm. His face was unreadable, but his eyes found her immediately, and something in them softened, just a fraction. "Mistress Margaret," he said quietly. "I came as soon as I heard." Margaret's breath caught. She had not realized, until that moment, how afraid she had been that he would believe Cedric, how much his good opinion had come to mean to her. "Your Majesty," she said, and her voice cracked on the words. "I did not. I swear to you, I had nothing to do with—" "I know." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. The space suddenly felt smaller, warmer, filled with his presence. He did not sit, did not approach, just stood there, looking at her with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she had never been seen before. "Lord Cedric brought me the vial this morning," he said. "He told me that you had been acting strangely since the night of the banquet, that you had been seen near the wine stores, that your quarters contained evidence of your guilt." "That is not true," Margaret said fiercely. "I have never been near the wine stores. I have never—" "I know," William said again. "I told him so. And when he pressed the matter, I told him that if he questioned your word again, he would find himself questioning."
"And in from the dungeons." Margaret stared at him. The Iron King of Ashford, the man who trusted no one, who had built his reign on suspicion and steel, had defended her, had threatened his own most trusted adviser for her sake. "Your Majesty," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "Why?" William was silent for a long moment. Then he crossed the room, slowly, deliberately, until he stood close enough that she could smell the cold and wood smoke on his cloak, could see the lines of exhaustion around his eyes. "Because I know what it is to be blamed for something you did not do," he said, "and because you saved my life, and because—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. "Because I have been alone in this castle for 20 years, and you are the first person who has made me feel that I might not have to be." The words fell between them like stones into still water. Margaret felt her heart turn over in her chest, a slow, painful, beautiful thing. "I am just a maid," she said, "a widow with a child. I have nothing to offer you." "You have everything," William said. "You have honesty, you have courage, you have a daughter who looked at me, the Iron King, and told me not to drink poison. Do you know how long it has been since anyone looked at me and saw a man, not a king?" Margaret shook her head, her eyes stinging. "I do not know how to answer that, Your Majesty." "Then don't." He reached out, hesitated, and then very gently took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses warm against her skin. "Just stay. Stay in the West Wing. Let me protect you and Alice until I find the truth. That is all I ask." She looked down at their joined hands, his large and scarred, hers small and work-worn. Two people who had been lonely for so long they had forgotten what it felt like to be held. "Your Majesty," she said, and her voice trembled, "I am afraid." "So am I," William said, and it was the most honest thing he had ever said. "Every day. Afraid of trusting again. Afraid of being betrayed. Afraid that if I let anyone close, I will lose them. But I am more afraid of spending the rest of my life alone in this cold castle, with no one to warm it." Margaret's hand curled around his. It was a small gesture, barely anything, but it was everything. "I will stay," she said. "I will trust you, and I will pray that we are both right." William's smile was slow, tentative, like a man learning an unfamiliar language. "That is all I can ask," he said. They stood there in the fading light, hand in hand, while the castle hummed around them with rumors and whispered accusations. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved. And for a moment, just a moment, the world outside the West Wing did not exist. It was Alice who broke the spell. The door burst open, and the 7-year-old tumbled through, Elena bustling behind her with a look of flustered apology. Alice's face was smudged with dirt, her hair wild, her eyes bright. "Mama!" she cried, launching herself at Margaret. "They said you were in trouble, but I told them you weren't. I told them you would never do a bad thing. And Elena said I was making a fuss, but I wasn't making a fuss. I was being right." Margaret caught her daughter in her arms, holding her tight, her face buried in the child's hair. William stepped back, giving them space, but he did not leave. "Alice," he said, and the girl looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Your mother is not in trouble. I promise you that." Alice studied him with the grave seriousness of a child who had learned to read adults. "Do you promise for real?" she asked.
"Think like cross your heart promise." William considered this. Then he knelt down, the Iron King of Ashford, kneeling on the floor of a maid's room, and held out his hand. "Cross my heart," he said solemnly. Alice solemnly shook his hand, her small fingers disappearing into his grip. "Then I believe you. Mama says a promise is a promise, and the king is too big to lie." "The king is too big to lie," William repeated, and there was something in his voice, a thickness, a warmth, that made Margaret's heart ache. "I think your mama is very wise." "She is," Alice agreed. "She knows everything. She even knows where the stars go in the daytime." Elena, who had been hovering in the doorway, let out a small, choked sound. "Your Majesty," she said, "the council has been looking for you. There is a matter that requires your attention." William rose, his face smoothing back into its familiar mask. But before he left, he turned to Margaret, and his eyes held hers for a long moment. "I will find the truth," he said. "I promise you that too." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him, and Margaret was left alone with her daughter and the echo of his words. "Mama?" Alice tugged at her sleeve. "Is the king really going to make it better?" Margaret pulled her daughter close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Yes, my love," she said. "I think he is." But even as she said it, she felt the cold thread of fear winding through her chest. Because she had seen the look in Lord Cedric's eyes that morning, and she knew that a man who would poison a king would not hesitate to silence a maid. The shadow was falling over Ashford Castle, and it was only a matter of time before it found them. The first night of her confinement, Margaret did not sleep. She lay on the narrow bed in the west wing, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind pick up around the castle walls. Alice had been taken to the servants' quarters with Elena, for safety, they said, though Margaret knew it was really to keep her compliant. A mother who knew her child was being watched would not try to run. She had tried to be brave when they led Alice away. She had kissed her daughter's forehead, smoothed her hair, told her that the king was going to make everything better. Alice had looked at her with those clear blue eyes, so full of trust, and said, "I know, Mama. The king is big, and he promised." The king is big, the king promised. Margaret pressed her fist to her mouth and prayed, in the dark, that her daughter's faith was not misplaced. She must have drifted off eventually, because the next thing she knew, the gray light of early morning was filtering through the window, and something small and hard was pressing against the sole of her foot through the blanket. She sat up, heart pounding. A stone, smooth, gray, no larger than her thumb, lay on the bed where her feet had been. It was clean, as if it had been washed, and faintly warm, as if it had been held in someone's hand. Margaret picked it up, turning it over in her palm. There was no note, no message, just the stone. She slipped it into the pocket of her dress and did not tell anyone. The second night, there were 2 stones. She had been sitting by the window, watching the last light fade from the snow-covered courtyard, when she heard it, a soft scrape against the door, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. By the time she crossed the room and opened the door, the corridor was empty. But on the threshold lay a second stone, smaller than the first, gray with a white vein running through it like a tiny vein, and beside it, folded neatly, a length of soft gray wool, a woman's shawl, fine enough to belong to a lady, warm enough to ward off the chill of the west wing. Margaret picked up the shawl, her fingers trembling. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and cedar.
the same smell that clung to William's cloak when he stood too close. She held it to her face and breathed in, and something in her chest cracked open, just a little. The third night she waited. She sat in the chair by the fire, the shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the 2 stones in her lap, and she waited. The hours crept by. The fire burned low. She heard the castle settle into its nightly quiet, the last footsteps of servants, the distant bark of a guard's order, the creak of old timbers adjusting to the cold. And then, just before midnight, she heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming down the West Wing corridor. They stopped outside her door. Margaret held her breath. The shadows under the door shifted, someone standing there, hesitating. Then there was a soft sound, barely audible, of something being set down on the stone floor. She did not move. She did not speak. She wanted to. She wanted to open the door, to see his face, to ask him if he had found anything, to beg him to tell her Alice was safe. But something held her still, some instinct that told her this moment was fragile, that speaking would break whatever spell had brought him here. After a long moment, the footsteps resumed, quieter now, retreating back the way they had come. Margaret waited until they had faded entirely. Then she rose, crossed to the door, and opened it. A third stone lay on the threshold, and this time there was something else. A small piece of folded parchment, sealed with a blob of wax that bore no sigil, only the mark of a thumb pressed into it while still warm. Margaret picked it up. Her hands were shaking as she broke the seal. The note inside was written in a firm, angular hand, the letters pressed hard into the parchment. "The truth is closer than you think. Be patient. Trust no one but me. W." She read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, tucked it into the pocket of her dress with the stones and the shawl, and sat down by the fire. She did not sleep that night either, but this time she was not afraid. The mornings were the hardest. Without Alice, the West Wing felt cavernous. Margaret had grown so used to her daughter's chatter, her constant questions, her small hands reaching for things she should not touch, that the silence was almost unbearable. She filled it with work. She mended every piece of linen in her basket. She scrubbed the floor until her knees ached. She polished the window glass until she could see her own reflection in it, pale and hollow-eyed. It was on the 4th morning that Elena came. The housekeeper slipped through the door with a basket of bread and cheese, her round face creased with worry. She set the basket on the table, then reached into her apron and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. "From Alice," she said. "She made me promise to give it to you. Says it's a secret message." Margaret unfolded it. Inside, in Alice's wobbly, oversized letters, was a drawing, a stick figure with a crown standing next to a smaller stick figure with a skirt, and between them, a heart. Beneath it, in letters that Elena had clearly helped with, "Mama, I am okay, the king said so. I am helping him find the bad man. Love, Alice." Margaret had to press her fist to her mouth to keep from crying. "She's safe?" she managed. "Safe as a kitten in a bath." "Fit," Linnea said firmly. "And spoiled rotten, if you ask me. The king had a tray of honey cakes sent up to the servants' quarters yesterday, for the child," he said. "The whole kitchen is buzzing about it." "Honey cakes?" Margaret closed her eyes. William had seen Alice's sweet tooth that night by the fire, the way she had eyed the honey pot with longing, he remembered. "She's helping him," Margaret said, almost to herself. "She is helping him find the truth." Eleni's expression flickered. Something careful, something guarded. "The girl talks to him, you know. When he comes to check on her, she tells him things. About you, about the castle, about what she saw that night in the cellar." Margaret's eyes flew open. She told him about the man in the cellar? Not directly, she doesn't remember his face. He was in shadow, and she was hiding. But she told the king about the cellar itself, about the barrels, the shelves, the way the light came in from the grate. Elena leaned in, lowering her voice. "He sent a man down there yesterday. Found a loose stone in the wall, behind the wine racks. Hidden inside was a key to a private door in the east corridor, the one that leads to Lord Cedric's private study." Margaret's blood went cold. Cedric. "The king hasn't moved yet. He's waiting, building his case. But he told me to tell you. He's close.
and he wants you to stay exactly where you are, safe, unseen. Margaret nodded, her mind racing. Lord Cedric, the man who had stood at William's right hand for a decade, who had been the first to suggest the search of her quarters, who had produced the vial with such righteous outrage. The man who had looked at Alice, that day in the great hall, with an expression that made Margaret's skin crawl. "Elena," she said, her voice urgent,
"Keep Alice close. Do not let her out of your sight. If Cedric realizes what she saw, he doesn't know," Elena said quickly. "The girl never saw his face, and the king has been careful to keep her away from the East Wing entirely. She's safe, Maggie, I swear it." Margaret wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that her daughter was safe, that William was close to the truth, that this nightmare would soon be over. She did not know that even as Elena spoke, Lord Cedric was walking down the West Wing corridor, his polished boots making no sound on the stone. She did not know that he had been watching the room for 3 days. She did not know, not yet, that when the door swung open and he stepped inside, his smile was the smile of a man who had already won. "Mistress Margaret," Lord Cedric said, closing the door behind him. "How kind of you to receive me." Margaret rose slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She kept her face calm, her hands still at her sides. "My lord," she said, "I was not told to expect visitors." "Visitors are not a thing one expects when one is confined," Cedric agreed. He was a handsome man, silver-haired and sharp-featured, with the easy confidence of someone who had never been denied anything in his life. "But I am not a visitor. I am the king's most trusted advisor, and I have come to offer you a way out of your predicament." Margaret's fingers itched toward the pocket where the stones and the note rested. She forced herself to stand still. "I do not know what you mean, my lord." "Of course you do." Cedric's smile widened. "You are a clever woman. You knew exactly what you were doing when you sent your little girl to warn the king. A clever ploy. Make him grateful. Make him trust you. Then strike when he least expects it." "I must admit, I admire the audacity." The words hit her like a slap. I would never—" "Save your protests." Cedric waved a hand dismissively. "I am not here to accuse you. On the contrary, I am here to make you an offer. The king has been difficult lately, unwilling to see reason, unwilling to accept that the woman he has taken such a liking to is not what she seems." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a murmur. "But I know how to handle these things. I know the truth about you, Margaret. I know about your husband, the soldier who died at Thornwood Pass. I know about the debts he left behind, and I know that a woman in your position would do almost anything to secure her daughter's future." Margaret's blood was ice in her veins. She could not speak. "All I ask," Cedric said, "is that you persuade the king to dismiss the investigation. Tell him you were mistaken. Tell him the wine was not poisoned, that your daughter imagined it, that you have reconsidered and believe there has been some misunderstanding. Do this, and I will see that you and your daughter are well provided for. Do this, and you will never want for anything again." The offer hung in the air between them, slick with false kindness. Margaret looked at him, at his smiling face, his cold eyes, his hands folded neatly in front of him like a man who had never gotten his hands dirty in his life. And she thought of William, the way he had looked at her in the firelight, the way he had knelt before her daughter and made a solemn promise, the way he had held her hand and told her he was afraid. "No," she said. Cedric's smile did not flicker, but something in his eyes went flat. "No?" "I would rather die than lie to him," Margaret said. "He trusted me when no one else would. He believed me when you tried to destroy me, and I will not repay that with betrayal. Not for silver, not for safety, not for anything you can offer." Cedric studied her for a long moment. Then he laughed, a soft, pleasant sound that made Margaret's skin crawl. "How touching," he said. "The maid in love with the king. I have seen this before, you know. It never ends well for the maid." He turned toward the door, then paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Think about my offer, Mistress Margaret. It will not be on the table forever. And when your daughter is the one paying the price for your pride, I hope you will remember that I gave you a chance." The door closed behind him. Margaret stood frozen in the middle of the room, her heart pounding, her hands shaking, and then the door opened again, and William stepped in. His face was stone, his eyes were cold. He had heard everything. "Your Majesty,"
Margaret whispered. I did not know he was coming, I swear, I did not. I know. His voice was rough, barely controlled. I cave as soon as I saw him leave the East Wing. I was watching. I have been watching. He crossed the room, stopping close enough that she could see the fury burning in his eyes. I heard what you said. Every word. Margaret's throat tightened. He threatened Alice. He said she would pay the price. He will not touch her. William's voice was iron. He will not touch either of you. I have what I need. Evidence, witnesses, proof of his betrayal. He does not know I have it yet. He thinks he is still winning. He reached out, his hand brushing her cheek, a feather-light touch, barely there. You chose me, he said, and there was wonder in his voice. When he offered you safety, wealth, a way out, you chose me. Margaret turned her face into his palm, her eyes so
Thinking. I chose the truth, she said. And the truth is that I trust you. I trust you with my life, with my daughter's life. I do not know what that makes me, a fool perhaps, but I cannot help it. William's jaw tightened. His hand cradled her cheek like she was something precious, something fragile. It makes you brave, he said. The bravest woman I have ever known. He leaned in, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough that she could feel his breath on her lips. A knock shattered the moment. Your Majesty, the voice was urgent, muffled through the door. Your Majesty, there's been a fire in the East Wing. Lord Cedric's private study. It's burning. William went still. His hand dropped from Margaret's face. The evidence, he said. He's burning the evidence. And then he was gone. The door swinging shut behind him, leaving Margaret alone in the quiet room with the echo of his words and the cold certainty that the shadow over Ashford Castle had just grown darker. The fire in the East Wing burned for 3 hours. By the time the servants and guards managed to contain it, Lord Cedric's private study was a smoking ruin. The desk, the shelves, the carefully organized documents, all reduced to ash and charred wood. The evidence William had spent 3 days gathering, gone. Margaret heard the news from Elena, who brought her a tray of supper she could not eat. The housekeeper's face was gray with exhaustion, her hands trembling as she set down the bread and cheese. They're saying it was an accident, Elena said. A candle left too close to a curtain. But Maggie, that study was locked. I saw the lock myself the day before. Strong iron knew. No candle burns through an iron lock by accident. Margaret nodded slowly. She hectored. Things sink to mean sitting by the window, watching the glow of the fire fade from the courtyard, the third stone from Alice clutched in her palm. Has the king spoken to you since? Elena asked. No, he has been occupied. Margaret's voice was quiet. She had not seen William since he left her room, his face set with fury and purpose. That was almost a full day ago now. He's not sleeping, Elena said. I saw him in the great hall at midnight, pacing. He looked like a man who has been pushed to the edge. Where is Alice? Margaret asked, the question sharp and sudden. Elena, is she safe? Safe as can be, Elena assured her. She's in the servants' quarters with the other women. I checked on her an hour ago. She was curled up with one of the kitchen cats, fast asleep. Margaret wanted to believe it. She wanted to believe that her daughter was safe, that the fire was an accident, that Cedric's threat had been empty words. But she had seen the look in his eyes when he left her room, and she knew, with a mother's certainty, that this was not over. The attack came at midnight. Margaret was lying awake in the darkness when she heard it. A scream, high and thin, cutting through the castle's night quiet. Her blood turned to ice. She was on her feet before the echo died, her heart pounding. Alice? She ran, down the West Wing corridor, through the great hall, her bare feet slapping on the cold stone. The scream had come from the direction of the servants' quarters. She knew it. She knew her daughter's voice. She rounded the corner into the east corridor and saw them. A man, big, hooded, a guard's cloak over his shoulders, was dragging Alice toward the side door that led to the outer courtyard. Alice was fighting, kicking, her small body twisting in his grip, her mouth open in a thing that was cut off, as the man clamped his hand over her face. Alice! Margaret shrieked. She threw herself forward, but the man was fast. He was already through the door, already dragging her daughter into the darkness beyond. Margaret's legs would not carry her fast enough. She stumbled,
caught herself on the doorframe, and saw the man cross the courtyard toward a waiting horse, Alice thrown over his shoulder like a sack of grain. "Stop! Someone help!" Margaret's voice tore through the night. "The king! Someone fetch the king!" And then, out of the darkness, a shape exploded. William came from nowhere, from the shadows of the stable, from the darkness of the watchtower, no one knew where. He moved like a wolf, fast and silent, and before the hooded man could reach the horse, William was there, his sword at, his voice a thunderclap of fury. "Put the child down. Now." The man froze. Alice's muffled screams cut off as she caught sight of the king. The man, Margaret recognized him now, a low-ranking guard named Rolf, who had always been too eager to please, looked at the king, looked at the horse, looked at the child in his arms. His face went white. "Your Majesty, I was ordered." "I don't care who ordered you." William's voice was ice and steel. "Put the child down, and you may walk away with your life. Continue, and you will not leave this courtyard standing." Rolf's grip on Alice tightened. The girl went limp in his arms, her eyes huge and terrified. "Lord Cedric said she is the witness," Rolf said, his voice shaking. "He said if the girl disappears, the whole thing falls apart. He said, 'Lord Cedric is a traitor,'" William said, "and he will hang for what he has done. But you still have a choice. Be a fool and die for a man who would sell you to the Gaul."
Think the moment it suited him, or set the child down and walk away. For a long moment Rolf did nothing. The wind howled across the courtyard. Alice whimpered. Then Margaret spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the night like a bell. "Please," she said. "She is just a child. She is my whole world. Please, I am begging you. Let her go." Rolf's eyes flickered to her, then back to the king. His shoulders sagged. "I never wanted this," he muttered. "I never wanted to hurt a child." He set Alice down on the cobblestones, stepped back, and raised his hands. William moved like a striking snake. He shoved Rolf aside, swept Alice up into his arms, and turned. And then the arrow came. It struck him in the shoulder, a sharp, ugly sound, and William staggered, a grunt of pain escaping his lips. Alice screamed. Margaret screamed. From the shadows at the far end of the courtyard, a figure lowered a crossbow and then vanished into the darkness. "Your Majesty!" 2 guards burst from the castle, weapons drawn. They saw the king, bleeding, the maid's child in his arms, the cowering Rolf, and froze. "Secure him!" William ground out, jerking his head toward Rolf. "And find the man with the crossbow. Find Lord Cedric. He's still in the castle." The guards scrambled. William turned, Alice still held against his chest with his uninjured arm, and walked toward Margaret. She met him halfway, her hands outstretched, her face wet with tears. She reached him just as his knees buckled, just as the strength went out of his legs. "Your Majesty!" She caught him, her arms around him, Alice pressed between them. "William! Oh, God, William!" "I'm all right," he said, but his voice was thin, and she could feel the warmth of blood soaking through his sleeve. "I'm all right. The child is she's safe," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "She's safe because of you." Alice wrapped her arms around William's neck, her face buried in his shoulder, sobbing. Margaret held them both, her hand pressed against the wound in his shoulder, trying to stop the bleeding. "Someone get the physician!" she shouted into the night. "Now!" Within minutes, the courtyard was full of people. Guards, servants, the physician with his leather bag. They lifted William, carrying him toward the great hall, his hand still holding Alice's small one. Margaret walked beside him, her fingers wrapped around his, unwilling to let go. "I'm not scared," Alice whispered, her voice hiccuping through tears. "I'm not scared. I'm not scared." William's hand tightened around hers. His face was pale, sweat beading on his brow, but his voice was steady. "I know you're not," he said. "You're the bravest girl in the whole kingdom. You and your mother both." Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She had never seen a man bleed like that for anyone, let alone for her child. She had never been held by anyone who made her feel so safe and so terrified at the same time. The physician worked in the great hall, in front of the roaring fire. He cut away William's tunic, revealed the arrow embedded in his shoulder, and set about removing it. William did not flinch, did not make a sound. His eyes stayed fixed on Margaret, who stood at the foot of the table, Alice in her arms. "Your Majesty," the physician said, "this will hurt." "Do it," William said. His eyes never left Margaret's. The arrow came out with a wet sound. William's jaw tightened, but he did not cry out. The physician stitched the wound, bandaged it, and stepped back with a relieved sigh. "You will live."
"Majesty," he said, "but you will need rest. The wound is clean, but it will take time to heal."
"Time," William repeated. "I have a traitor to catch. I do not have time."
"Your Majesty, leave us." William's voice was quiet, but it brooked no argument. The physician bowed and left, followed by the guards, by Elena, who paused at the door to give Margaret a long, meaningful look, and finally, reluctantly, by everyone else. The great hall fell silent. Only the fire crackled and Alice's quiet sniffles and the sound of William's breathing. Margaret set Alice down gently. The girl immediately ran to William's side, her small hand reaching up to touch his bandaged shoulder. "Does it hurt?" she asked, her voice small. "Some," William admitted. "But I have had worse." "Your Majesty," Margaret said, and her voice was hoarse, "you risked your life for her, for my daughter. I do not know how to thank you." William reached out, slowly, carefully, and took her hand. His palm was warm, his fingers strong despite the trembling of his arm. "You do not need to thank me," he said. "I would do it again, 100 times, 1,000. He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I would do it for you, Margaret. Not because you are a maid, or a widow, or the mother of a brave child, but because you have become something I did not think I would ever have again." "What?" she whispered. "Someone to fight for." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and bright as gold. Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "William," she said. "His name?" "Just his name. No, Your Majesty, no title, just the name of the man who had bled for her daughter." He pulled her closer, gently, carefully, mindful of his wound. She came to him, her head against his chest, his arms around her, and Alice, small and warm, pressed between them. "I am afraid," Margaret whispered. "I am so afraid of what will happen next. Cedric is still out there. He will not stop until—" "He will be caught," William said. "I will catch him. I will put a rope around his neck and watch him pay for what he has done. And then I will ask you something, Margaret. Something I have been wanting to ask you for a long time." She looked up at him, her eyes red, her face streaked with tears and soot. "What?" William's smile was tired but real. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight I just want to hold you and her and be glad that we are all still alive." Alice yawned, her small body going limp against them. Margaret laughed, a wet, shaky sound, and pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead. "Sleep, my love," she said. "You are safe now. The king will fix everything." Alice's eyes fluttered closed. "The king is big," she murmured, already half asleep. "The king is big and strong, and he doesn't lie." William looked at Margaret over the child's head. His eyes were soft, warm, full of something she was almost afraid to name. "No," he said quietly. "The king doesn't lie, and the king will not let anything happen to either of you, not ever again." Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in the darkness, a man was running, a traitor, a killer, a shadow with a crossbow. And in the great hall of Ashford Castle, by the warmth of the fire, 3 people held each other and waited for the dawn. Morning would bring the hunt. Morning would bring the reckoning. But tonight, there was only this, and it was enough. They found Lord Cedric at dawn, hiding in the cellar where Alice had first seen him pour poison into the king's wine. He was huddled behind the same barrels, his fine coat stained with dust, his silver hair disheveled, his hands empty of the crossbow he had used the night before. The guards dragged him into the great hall in chains.
Word spread through the castle like wildfire, and by the time the morning light had fully risen, every servant, every guard, every noble in residence had gathered to witness the judgment of the king. Margaret stood at the front of the crowd, Alice's hand clasped tightly in hers. Elena stood behind them, her hand on Margaret's shoulder. They addressed Alice in clean dress, brushed her hair until it shone, and told her to be brave. "I'm not scared," Alice whispered, but her voice was small, and her hand was trembling. "I know," Margaret said, squeezing her fingers. "I'm not scared either." That was a lie. Margaret had never been more terrified in her life. William sat on the dais, his shoulder bandaged beneath his tunic, his face carved from stone. He had not slept, she could see it in the shadows under his eyes, the lines of exhaustion etched around his mouth. But he sat straight, his gaze fixed on the man being dragged before him. Lord Cedric looked nothing like the smooth, confident adviser who had threatened Margaret in her room. His face was pale, his eyes wild, his lips pressed into a thin line of defiance. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice hoarse, "I demand to be heard. I have served this kingdom for 10 years. You have poisoned my wine," William said. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the hall like ice on glass. "You have framed an innocent woman for the crime. You have tried to kidnap a child, Cedric, and you have murdered my trust in you." Cedric's jaw worked. "You have no proof. The evidence was destroyed. I have witnesses," William gestured, and Rolf was brought forward. The guard's face was gray, his hands bound, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Tell them," William said. "Tell them what you told me." Rolf swallowed. His voice came out in a rush, as if he was desperate to get the words out before he lost his nerve. "Lord Cedric came to me 3 days before the banquet. He said there was a man in the castle who was a threat to the kingdom. He said the king had enemies everywhere, and that one of them was planning to poison him. He gave me the nightshade. He told me to pour it into the wine jug, the one with the silver stag. He said if anyone asked, I was to say I had seen the maid Margaret near the wine stores." "And the vial in her quarters?" "Lord Cedric gave it to me. He told me to hide it in her sewing basket." Rolf's voice broke. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt the child. I never—" "Enough!" Cedric's voice cracked through the hall. "This is a lie. This is a conspiracy." "Rolf," William said calmly, "where is the key I found in your quarters? The key to Lord Cedric's private study?" Rolf's face went even whiter. "In my pocket, Your Majesty. He told me to burn the documents." "He told you to burn the documents," William repeated. "And you did. But you forgot something, didn't you, Rolf?" Rolf's mouth opened and closed. "I don't—" "Show them," William said. A guard stepped forward and placed a small object on the table before the dais. It was a piece of burnt parchment, barely recognizable, but on it, in faded ink, was a signature. A flowing, confident hand that matched the signature on every order Cedric had ever signed. "The fire did not destroy everything," William said. "This fragment was found in the ashes. It is a letter, written in your hand, to a contact in the neighboring kingdom, promising that the king of Amidst would be dead within a week, and that his loyal adviser would be ready to take the throne." Cedric's face went gray. That is forgery." "It is your hand," William said. "I would know it anywhere. I have trusted you for 10 years, Cedric. I have signed every document you placed before me. I know your writing better than I know my own." The hall was silent. Cedric's shoulders slumped. The defiance drained out of him like water from a cracked vessel. "You were supposed to be dead," he muttered. "You were supposed to die that night, and then I would—" "Then you would what?" William's voice was soft, almost curious. "Take the throne? Rule a kingdom you had no right to? You were my most trusted adviser. I gave you everything, and you repaid me with nightshade." Cedric said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the floor. William rose. His voice filled the hall. "Lord Cedric of Ashford, I find you guilty of attempted murder, of treason, and of conspiracy against the crown. You are stripped of your titles, your lands, and your name. You are hereby sentenced to permanent exile from this kingdom. If you are ever found within its borders again, you will be hanged without trial." He paused, and his voice dropped. "Take him away." The guards dragged Cedric out, his protests fading into the morning air. The hall was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, the murmurs began. A low tide of relief and disbelief. William raised his hand and the murmurs died. "There is one more thing," he said. His eyes found Margaret in the crowd. "Mistress Margaret of the West Wing, please come forward." Margaret's heart stopped. She felt Alice's hand tighten on hers, felt Elena's reassuring squeeze on her shoulder, felt the weight of every eye in the hall turned toward her. She walked forward, out to her side, her legs trembling beneath her. When she reached the dais, she curtsied, deeply, formally, as she had been taught to do for the king. William descended from the dais. He stood before her, close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat, the weariness in his eyes. "Mistress Margaret," he said, and his voice was gentle now, stripped of its authority. "You and your daughter saved my life. You refused to lie for a traitor. You stood firm when everything was against you. And last night you held my hand while a physician dug an arrow out of my shoulder." Margaret's eyes stung. "Your Majesty, William," he corrected her softly so only she could hear. "Please, just William." She swallowed. "William." He smiled. A small, tired, beautiful smile. "Margaret, Alice, from this day forward, you are no longer servants of this castle. You are guests of the crown, honored friends of the King of Ashford. Whatever you need, whatever you want, you have only to ask." The hall erupted. Gasps, whispers, a few scattered cheers. Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "William," she said again, and it was a prayer, a promise, a benediction. Alice, who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes, tugged on William's sleeve. "Does this mean we get to stay in the big rooms?" she asked. William laughed, a real laugh, warm and surprised. "If your mother agrees, you can have any room in the castle." Alice looked up at Margaret, her face bright with hope. "Mama, can we?" Margaret could not speak. She nodded, and Alice threw her arms around William's legs, hugging him tight. "Thank you," Alice said into his tunic. "Thank you, big king." William's hand came down to rest on the child's head, gentle and sure. "You are welcome, little one." That night, long after the celebration had ended, Margaret found herself in William's private chambers. It was a simple room for a king, a bed, a desk, a chair by the fire. No tapestries, no gold, no symbols of power. Just a man's living space, sparse and functional, like the man himself. The fire crackled in the hearth. Alice was asleep in a small alcove off the main room, wrapped in blankets, her face peaceful. Margaret had tucked her in an hour ago and had been standing by the window ever since, looking out at the snow-covered courtyard. William came to stand beside her. His shoulder was still bandaged, his arm in a sling, but he moved with a quiet ease, as if the pain was a familiar companion. "You have not asked me," he said, "what I wanted to ask you." Margaret turned to look at him. In the firelight, his face was softer, the hard lines smoothed away, the weariness replaced by something vulnerable and uncertain. "Ask me now," she said. William took a breath. Then he reached into his tunic and pulled out a small velvet pouch. He opened it, and from it he took a brooch, a deep blue sapphire, set in silver, catching the firelight like a star. Margaret's breath caught. "It's beautiful." "It was my mother's," William said. His voice was quiet, careful. "She died when I was 7 years old. My father, he never spoke of her. He never let me speak of her. He thought that grief was weakness, that a king's son should not weep for his mother." His fingers traced the edge of the brooch. "She died in a fire. A terrible accident in the East Wing. My father ordered the room sealed, the memories buried. He never wore black, never mourned her publicly. He simply erased her." Margaret felt her heart ache. "William, that is why I never stand too close to the fire," he said. "It reminds more. Think of her. Of the night I lost her. Of the silence that followed." He looked at her, and his eyes held the core of a grief he had carried alone for nearly 30 years.
and it is why I have never let anyone close, because everyone I have ever loved has been taken from me." Margaret reached out slowly and touched his hand. "Not everyone." William's breath shuddered. "I told you I would ask you something, so I will ask it now." He held out the brooch. "Margaret of the West Wing, I am not a good man. I am cold and distant, and I have spent 20 years pushing people away. But you have shown me that I do not have to live that way. You have shown me that there is warmth in this world and that it is worth fighting for." He paused. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Will you stay? Not as a guest, not as a servant, but as my wife, as the woman who stands beside me, who warms my cold castle, who reminds me that I am a man and not just a king." Margaret's tears were falling freely now. She looked at the brooch, at the man holding it, at the Iron King who had bled for her daughter, who had knelt before her child, who had opened his heart to her after 30 years of ice. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will stay. I will stay forever." William let out a breath, as if he had been holding it for years. He pinned the brooch to her dress, his fingers trembling, and then he took her face in his hands and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, a first kiss full of promise and fear and hope. Margaret melted into it, her hands on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they broke apart, Alice's sleepy voice drifted from the alcove. "Mama, are you kissing the king?" Margaret laughed, a bright, surprised sound. "Go back to sleep, love. But if you marry the Kiev..." "Sane?" Della said, sitting up, her hair a wild tangle. "Does that mean he becomes my papa?" William and Margaret looked at each other. William's eyes were soft, warm, full of wonder. "If your mother agrees," he said, "then yes, I would be honored to be your papa." Alice's face split into a huge grin. She scrambled off the alcove, ran across the room, and threw herself at William, who caught her with his good arm and lifted her up. "Papa," she crowed, loud enough that the guards outside probably heard. "I have a papa." Margaret watched them, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The Iron King of Ashford, holding a 7-year-old girl in his arms, laughing like a boy who had just discovered the sun. "I love you," she said, so quietly that only she could hear, and then, louder, "I love you, William." He turned to her, Alice still in his arms, and his smile was brighter than any fire. "I love you too, Margaret, more than I know how to say." The fire crackled, the snow fell, and in the heart of Ashford Castle, a man who had been frozen for 30 years began, at last, to thaw. Spring came to Ashford Castle like a slow green tide. The snow melted from the courtyard, running in bright rivulets through the cobblestones. The ice on the moat cracked and broke apart, and the first birds returned to the battlements, singing loud and defiant against the lingering cold. Margaret stood at the window of her new chambers in the East Wing, the King's Wing, with a view over the gardens that had been frozen and bare when she first arrived. Now the earth was soft and dark, and the first green shoots were pushing through the soil. She touched the brooch at her collar, the blue sapphire of William's mother, warm against her skin. "Are you coming, Mama?" "Alice." Force rang from the corridor, bright and impatient. "Papa says we're planting the tree today, and if I'm late, he'll pick the spot without me." Margaret smiled. 6 months had changed her daughter. She was taller, sturdier, her cheeks flushed with health and happiness. She no longer flinched at shadows, no longer whispered, "I'm not scared," in the dark. The castle had become her home, and the king had become her father. Margaret had watched it happen, day by day, with a wonder she could not name. William, who had never held a child before Alice, now knew her favorite songs, her secret fears, the hidden places where she kept her small treasures. He had learned to braid hair badly and to make a convincing crown out of twigs and string. He had read her 100 stories, tucked her in 1,000 times, and taught her that the stars had names. She had fallen in love with him all over again, in ways she had not known were possible. "Coming!" she called, and she went out to meet them.
The garden was alive with the sounds of spring, the chattering of birds, the creak of a cartwheel, the voices of servants working the soil. But Margaret had eyes only for the two figures at the center of the lawn. William stood with his sleeves rolled up, a shovel in his hands, a streak of dirt across his cheek, and a grin that made him look 10 years younger. Alice danced around him, her skirts hitched up, a basket of seedlings in her arms. "There you are," William said, his eyes lighting up as she approached. "Your daughter was about to conduct the entire planting ceremony without us." "I'm not a ceremony," Alice said, with all the dignity a 7-year-old could muster. "I'm a helper." "She's a helper," William agreed, winking at Margaret. "The best helper a king could ask for." They had chosen the spot together, a patch of ground at the edge of the garden, where the morning sun came first, and the view opened out toward the valley. William had said it reminded him of the place where he had first imagined a future worth having. Now, with Alice directing and Margaret holding the sapling steady, William dug the hole and set the young apple tree into the earth. "Apple trees take years to bear fruit," he said, packing the soil around the roots. "You have to be patient. You have to water it and prune it and protect it from frost and pests. And even then, you cannot be sure it will thrive. You can only do your best and trust that it will grow." Margaret looked at him, at the dirt on his hands, the hope in his eyes, the way he kept glancing at Alice like she was the sun. "I know something about that," she said softly, "planting things in hard ground and hoping they take root." William's smile deepened. "You do," he said, "and I know something about it too. I have been trying to grow something in frozen soil for a very long time. But I think the thaw has finally come." Alice, who had been busily arranging the last of the seedlings around the tree's base, stood up and brushed off her hands. "There," she said with satisfaction. "Now it's a proper tree, but it needs a name. Every good tree needs a name." William considered. "What would you name it, little one?" Alice thought hard, then her face lit up. "I'm going to call it Mama's Heart, because it's planted in the place where Papa loves Mama, and that's where my heart lives too." Margaret felt her eyes sting. She knelt down and pulled Alice into her arms, pressing a kiss to her daughter's hair. "That's the best name in the whole world," she said, her voice thick. William came to stand beside him's hand resting on Margaret's shoulder. For a long moment they stood together in the spring sunshine, looking at the little apple tree with its tender new leaves and its fresh-turned soil. "I have something for you," William said. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. "I meant to give it to you at the wedding, but I think it belongs here, by this tree, in this moment." Margaret took it, her fingers brushing his. She unfolded it. The letter was in William's hand, bold, angular, the letters pressed firmly into the page. "Dear Margaret, I am not a poet. I do not have the words to tell you what you have done to me, to my life, to the cold stone walls of this castle that you have somehow turned into a home. Before you came, I was a man made of ice. I did not trust. I did not love. I did not hope. I thought that was the only way to survive. Then a child I had never met told me not to drink poison, and you stood behind her, your eyes full of fear and courage. And I thought, there is something worth protecting. I have spent my whole life protecting my kingdom. I have never had anyone to protect for myself. I am asking you, no, I am telling you, that I will spend the rest of my days protecting you and Alice. I will water this tree with you every spring. I will watch it grow with you every year. I will grow old with you, Margaret, and I will be grateful for every single day of it. I cannot promise you a life without hardship, but I can promise you this. You will never be alone again. You will never have to wonder if you are loved. You will never have to be afraid. Yours, forever." Margaret looked up from the letter. Tears were streaming down her face. But she was smiling, a bright, radiant smile that made William's breath catch. "William," she said, "I have a letter too, but it is not written on parchment." She pressed her hand to her heart. "It is written here, and it says, 'I love you. I love you beyond measure. I love you in every way there is to love a man, and I will be grateful for you, every day, for the rest of my life.'"
William pulled her into his arms, holding her against him like she was the most precious thing in the world. Alice wrapped her arms around both of them, laughing. "Papa," she said, "you're getting dirt on Mama's dress." "I am," William said, grinning. "And she does not care. Do you, Margaret?" "I do not care," she agreed, laughing through her tears. "I have never cared less about anything in my life." They stood there, the three of them, in the spring sunshine with the little apple tree standing watch over them. It was not a grand celebration, no feast, no ceremony, no witnesses but the birds and the sunshine, but it was everything. That evening, Elena brought up a tray of honey cakes and tea. She found the three of them in the garden, sitting on a blanket beneath the apple tree, watching the stars come out. "Your Majesty," she said with a knowing smile, "the council is looking for you. Something about a boundary dispute in the southern fields." William did not move. "They can wait until morning." "But, Your Majesty?" "Elena," William's voice was gentle, "I have spent 20 years solving the kingdom's problems. Tonight I am solving my own. Tell them I will see them at dawn." Elena looked at Margaret, at Alice, at the happy, peaceful faces of the little family beneath the tree. Her expression softened. "Very well, Your Majesty," she said. "I will tell them the king is otherwise occupied." She left them there, walking back toward the castle with spring in her step, humming a song she had not hummed in years. Alice had fallen asleep on the blanket, her head in Margaret's lap, her small hand still clutching a smooth gray stone, the last of the good-night stones she had left outside Margaret's door during those long, dark days. William reached over and brushed a strand of hair from the child's face. "She's grown so much," he said. 6 months ago she could not sleep without a lamp. Now she falls asleep under the open sky. "She feels safe," Margaret said. "Because of you." William looked at her, his eyes soft in the twilight. "Because of us," he corrected. "Because she has a mother who would die for her, and a father who would kill for her, and a home where she's loved." Margaret leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, her hand in his. "I used to think," she said, "that I was not allowed to be happy, that my happiness had died with Daniel, and that I had no right to ask for more. And now?" She looked up at him, at the man who had thawed her ice, who had given her daughter a father, who had planted an apple tree in the garden of a cold, lonely castle. "Now I know," she said, "that love is not a finite thing. It is not a candle that burns out. It is a tree. It grows, it spreads, it puts down roots, and even when you think it is died, it finds a way to bloom again in the spring." William kissed her, soft and slow, full of promise. "Happy spring, my love," he said. "Happy spring," she whispered back. And beneath them, in the dark earth, the roots of the little apple tree reached deep, anchoring itself to the soil of Ashford Castle, ready to grow, ready to bloom, ready to bear fruit for years to come. The night was quiet, the stars were bright, and in the garden of the castle that had been cold for so long, 3 people sat together beneath a young tree and were whole. The first morning in the old servant's room, Margaret woke before dawn and lay still, listening to the unfamiliar silence. The room was small and cold, tucked into the western turret where the wind found every crack. A narrow bed, a wooden stool, a wash basin that had not been used in years. The windows were high and small, letting in a pale gray light that seemed to have no source. It was a room for someone who was not meant to stay. Alice was curled beside her, one small hand clutching the edge of Margaret's sleeve, her breath soft and even. Margaret did not move. She watched the light creep across the ceiling and thought about the way William had looked at her the night before, the night the guards had come, the night the whispers had begun. He had not looked at her with suspicion. That was the strange part. He had looked at her with something else, something she could not name, something that had made her knees weak even as they led her away. "Mama?" Alice's voice was thick with sleep. "I'm here, love." "Are we in trouble?" Margaret stroked her daughter's hair. "No, sweetheart, we are just waiting. The king is going to find out who really did that terrible thing, and then everything will be all right." Alice was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very softly, "I miss him." Margaret's throat tightened. She missed him too.
missed the way he looked at her across the hall, missed the sound of his voice when he spoke to Alice, missed the impossible warmth of a man who had been called the Iron King. She had spent 3 nights in this cold room, and every night she had dreamed of his hands. "Elena will come soon," she said. "She'll bring us breakfast, and we'll be all right." Elena did come.
She had come every morning, bustling through the door with a tray of bread and cheese and a pot of tea that was still steaming. "Eat," the housekeeper commanded, setting the tray down with unnecessary force. "You look like a ghost, the both of you. And you, little one, I've brought you honey for your bread." Alice sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Is the king angry with us?" Elena's face softened. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her stiff corset creaking, and took Alice's small hand in hers. "No, child. The king is not angry with you. The king is doing what kings must do." "What is that?" Alice asked. Elena hesitated. She glanced at Margaret, then back at the child. "He is being careful. There are people in this castle who wish him harm, and he must find them before they can hurt anyone else. You and your mamma are safe here. I will see to it myself." After Elena left, Margaret unpacked their few belongings: the spare dress, the comb, the worn copy of a prayer book Alice had found in the library. There was nothing else. Their lives had been reduced to what they could carry in a cloth sack, and yet Margaret found she did not mind. The room was cold, but it was quiet. The walls were bare, but they were safe. On the 3rd day, Alice began leaving stones. It started without explanation. Margaret had been mending a torn hem when she noticed her daughter kneeling by the door, examining a small pebble she had found on the windowsill. "What are you doing, love?" Alice did not look up. "I'm putting it outside the door." "Why?" "Because the king walks by here at night." She said it with such certainty that Margaret didn't think to question her. "I heard his boots. Last night and the night before. He walks slow and he stops for a little while and then he goes away." Margaret's heart stumbled. "How do you know it's the king?" Alice shrugged, placing the pebble carefully on the stone floor just outside the door. "The boot steps are heavier than the guards, and he breathes loud like Papa used to when he was thinking." She straightened, dusted off her hands, and returned to Margaret's side. "It's a good luck stone. Papa said if you put a stone by a door, the person who finds it will have a good day, so I'm giving one to the king every night. So he has good days." Margaret did not know whether to laugh or cry. She pulled Alice into her lap and held her close, pressing her lips to the top of her daughter's head. "That is a very kind thing to do, my love. But the king may not understand. He might think it is strange." "He'll understand," Alice said with the unshakable confidence of a 7-year-old. "He's smart. He knows good luck stones when he sees them." That night, Margaret lay awake long after Alice had fallen asleep, listening. And sure enough, near midnight, she heard it. The heavy tread of boots in the corridor, slow and deliberate, stopping just outside their door. She held her breath. There was a long silence, then the soft scrape of a hand on stone, and the quiet sound of something being picked up. She did not hear him walk away. She heard the silence stretch on, as if he were standing there holding her daughter's small stone in his hand. The next morning, there was a silver coin on the floor outside their door, exactly where the stone had been. Alice found it first. She held it up, her eyes wide. "Mama, look! The king left us money!" "It's a gift," Margaret said, her voice rough. "Because of your stone." Alice beamed. "I told you he was smart." On the 4th day, Margaret found the blue brooch. It was sitting on treacherous windowsill, catching the thin morning light, its sapphire gleaming like a drop of sky. Beside it was a scrap of parchment, folded once with writing in a bold, uneven hand. "Nothing is lost that is meant to be found." Margaret picked up the brooch with trembling fingers. It was the same one, the one Alice had lost on the night they were taken away, the one William had given her daughter after the storm, the one that had made Alice cry for 2 days. She turned it over. The clasp had been repaired, the hinge new and bright. "Alice," she whispered. "Alice, come here." Alice patted over, still in her nightgown. When she saw the brooch, her face went through a dozen expressions in a single breath: surprise, disbelief, joy.
And then she burst into tears. "He found it," she sobbed, clutching the brooch to her chest. "Mama, the king found my brooch! He found it for me!" Margaret knelt and wrapped her arms around her daughter, feeling the child's body shake with sobs that were half grief, half relief. "Yes, love, he found it for you." She looked at the parchment again. Nothing is lost that is meant to be found, and she knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with reason, that he had not meant only the brooch. On the 5th day, Edmund came to the door. He was one of William's private guards, a tall, gray-haired man with a face like carved oak and eyes that missed nothing. He did not enter the room. He stood in the doorway, his hands clasped behind his back, and spoke in a low voice. "Mistress Margaret, the king asked me to tell you that the matter is progressing. He asks for your patience and your trust." Margaret met his eyes. "And the child? Is she safe?" "The king has posted 2 guards at the end of this corridor. No one approaches this door without his express word. You and the girl are the most protected people in the castle right now." She felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. Tell him we are well. Tell him Alice keeps leaving him stones." Edmund's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile she had ever seen on him. "He knows. He collects them. He keeps them in a small box on his desk." He left before she could respond, and Margaret stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the empty corridor, her hand pressed to her mouth. On the 6th day, Alina came with news. "They've found something," she said, keeping her voice low. "A merchant from the southern passes. He was carrying a letter with the king's seal, a forged one, asking for a shipment of nightshade. The merchant couldn't say who paid him, but he described a man with a gold ring on his left hand, a signet ring." Margaret's blood ran cold. She had seen that ring, had noticed it the night of the feast, when Lord Cedric had raised his glass to the king. "Alina," she said, "you should tell the king. You should—" "The king already knows." Alina's face was grim. "Edmund told him this morning. He's been waiting for it. He says he wants a few more days, to be certain, to make sure the net closes properly before he springs it." Margaret nodded slowly. She understood the need for certainty. She had spent her life learning to read men, to know when they were lying and when they were telling the truth. And she knew, deep in her bones, that William was not the kind of man to strike without being sure. That night, she did something she had not done in days. She put on her best dress, the blue one, the one she had worn to the feast, and she brushed her hair until it shone. She did not know why it mattered. It just did. When Alice was asleep, Margaret sat by the window, watching the moon rise over the hills. She thought about the silver coin, and the blue brooch, and the box of stones on a king's desk. She thought about a man who walked a cold corridor every night just to stand outside a door he could not open. And she thought about what it meant to be seen by someone who had spent his whole life looking at people without really seeing them. Near midnight, she heard the boots again. This time, she did not lie still. She rose, crossed the room, and pressed her hand flat against the door. She could feel the cold wood, the iron hinges, the weight of the years between them. "William," she said softly, her voice barely more than a breath. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment there was silence. Then she heard him move, felt the presence of him on the other side of the door. So close she could almost imagine the warmth of him through the wood. "Maggie." His voice was rough, low, barely audible. "Are you well?" "Better, now that I know you're there." Another silence. She heard him exhale, a long, shaky breath as if he had been holding it for days. "I will fix this," he said. "I will fix all of it. I swear it on my mother's grave." "I know you will," she said. "I've never doubted you." She heard his hand slide down the door, a slow, deliberate movement that ended at the latch. He did not open it. He simply left his hand there as if he could feel her through the wood. "When this is over," he said, "I'm going to open this door, and I'm going to take you and Alice into the garden, and I'm going to show you the apple tree I've been planting." "An apple tree? It's for Alice. I thought she might like to watch it grow." Margaret pressed her forehead against the door, her eyes burning. "It's winter, William. The tree doesn't care. It knows spring is coming." She heard him step back, his boots heavy on the stone, but before he walked away he said 3 more words,
3 words that undid her completely. "Stay with me." And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the cold room with her hand pressed to the door and her heart too full to speak. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the window, watching the moon cross the sky, and she thought about a man who had spent his whole life building walls around himself and who was now planting apple trees for a child he had never expected to love. On the 7th morning, Edmund came again. This time his face was different, harder, lighter, live with purpose. "The king has what he needs," he said. "Tomorrow at dawn the great hall will be opened. Lord Cedric will be summoned before the court." Margaret's heart clenched. "Is it certain?" "It is certain." Edmund's grey eyes met hers. "The king asks that you and the girl be present. He wants the court to see the people he has been protecting." She nodded slowly, her hands trembling. "He also asks that you wear the blue brooch," Edmund added. "He says it will remind him of what he's fighting for." Margaret pressed her hand to her chest, where the sapphire lay warm against her skin. "Tell him," she said, "that I will be there." Edmund nodded and left, and Margaret stood in the doorway of the small, cold room looking out at the corridor where a king had walked every night, where he had stopped and breathed and left silver coins in place of children's stones. The sun was rising, the spring was coming, and somewhere in the East Tower a man with a box of small stones on his desk was waiting for the dawn. The dawn came grey and cold, as if the sky itself knew what was about to happen. Margaret had not slept. She had sat by the narrow window of the West Wing room, watching the stars fade one by one, her hand pressed against the blue brooch at her throat. Alice slept curled on the narrow bed, her golden hair spread across the pillow, her small face peaceful in a way that made Margaret's heart ache. Today, everything would change. Today, the man who had tried to kill the king would be brought before the court, and she, a maid, a widow, a woman who had spent her life scrubbing floors and mending clothes, would stand in the great hall and bear witness. She dressed carefully. The dress was plain but clean, the best she owned. She pinned the blue brooch where it caught the light, and for a moment she thought of William's hands on that silver clasp, his voice low in the darkness of his study. It will remind him of what he's fighting for. "Mama?" Alice's voice was thick with sleep. "Is it time?" "Almost, love." Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and brushed the hair back from her daughter's face. "Are you ready?" Alice sat up, rubbing her eyes. Then she looked at her mother, and her small chin lifted. "I'm not scared." Margaret smiled and kissed her forehead. "I know, my brave girl." They walked through the corridors in silence, a guard before them and another behind. The castle was waking, servants with downcast eyes, guards with hands on their swords, the heavy smell of fear and expectation hanging in the air like smoke before a fire. They had just reached the corridor that led to the great hall when Margaret heard it. A commotion. Shouts. The clash of steel. The guard in front of her froze, his hand going to his sword. And then, from the side passage, a man burst out. Not a guard, not a servant, but a man in a fine coat with a face twisted in desperation. Lord Cedric. He was not supposed to be here. He was supposed to be waiting in the hall under guard, unaware that the evidence against him was complete. But here he was, wild-eyed, his fine coat torn, a dagger in one hand, and in the other, tangled in his grip, was Alice. The world stopped. "Mama!" Alice's cry was sharp, terrified. "Alice!" Margaret lunged forward, but the other guard caught her arm, holding her back. "Don't move," Cedric snarled, pressing the dagger close to Alice's throat. The child was rigid, her face white, but she did not scream. She looked at her mother with wide, terrified eyes, and her lips moved silently. "I'm not scared." "You," Cedric spat at Margaret, "you and that brat, you ruined everything. Months of planning, months of waiting, and a servant's whelp had to open her mouth." "Let her go." Margaret's voice came out steady, though her whole body was shaking. "She's a child. She has done nothing." "She took everything from me. I was meant to be the power behind the throne. I was meant to be the one they feared. And then you and your filthy little girl." "Lord Cedric." The voice came from behind them, low and cold as river ice.
William had emerged from the great hall, his sword drawn, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. "Release the child," Cedric laughed, a jagged, desperate sound. "Why would I do that, your majesty? So you can hang me? I know your man found the letters. I know what awaits me. But I will not go to my death alone. I will take something you value first." William's face did not change. But Margaret saw his hand tighten on the sword, saw the muscle jump in his jaw. "You have no idea what I value," he said quietly. "I know enough." Cedric's voice was venomous. "I've seen you, walking the West Wing at night,
Heaving coins like a lovesick boy, the Iron King, brought low by a maid and her brat. It would be almost amusing, if it weren't so pathetic. William moved. It was fast, faster than Margaret could follow. He lunged forward, his sword sweeping up, and Cedric stumbled back, dragging Alice with him. The child screamed, and Margaret tore free from the guard's grip and ran. "Alice! Alice!" Cedric bolted down the side passage, dragging Alice by the arm, her small feet scrambling to keep up. William was after him in an instant, his boots pounding on the stone, his voice rising in a roar that echoed through the castle. "Seal the East Tower! Seal it now!" Margaret ran after them, her breath ragged, her heart a wild drum in her chest. She could hear Alice crying, could hear Cedric cursing, could hear the clash of guards converging from every direction. They burst into the East Tower stairwell, a narrow spiral of stone that wound upward into shadow. Cedric had Alice by the wrist, half carrying her up the steps, and William was close behind, his sword glinting in the dim light. "Stop!" Cedric shouted, turning at the first landing. He held the dagger to Alice's throat again, and William halted, his chest heaving. "Let her go," William said. His voice was rough, almost pleading. "She is just a child. Take me instead." "Take you?" Cedric laughed. "And what would I do with you, your majesty? No, I think I'll take her to the top of the tower, and we'll see how fast you climb when you know what awaits her at the top." He backed up the stairs, dragging Alice with him. Margaret reached the bottom of the stairs, her lungs burning, and looked up to see William glance back at her. Just once, just for a moment. "Stay back," he said. "I'll bring her down." He turned and climbed. Margaret sat dunzen at the bottom, her hands pressed to her mouth, listening to the sounds of footsteps and shouts growing fainter as they climbed higher. The tower spiraled up into darkness, its narrow windows letting in thin blades of grey light. She could not stand there. She could not. She gathered her skirts and climbed. By the time she reached the upper landing, her legs were shaking. The top of the tower was open to the sky, a flat stone platform ringed by a low parapet, and there, at the edge, where the wind whipped her hair across her face, stood Cedric, with Alice held before him like a shield. William stood 10 paces away, his sword lowered, his eyes fixed on the child. "You see?" Cedric's voice was manic now, high and trembling. "You see what you made me do? I was a loyal man once. I served your father, I served you, and how was I rewarded, overshadowed, ignored, passed over for men with less wit and more blood? You poisoned my wine," William said quietly. "You would have killed me and taken the throne for yourself." "The throne? I didn't want the throne. I wanted to be the hand that held it. I wanted to be the one who whispered in the king's ear, who shaped the kingdom from the shadows. But you never listened. You never saw me. And that insolent child, she saw a man pour poison into a jug, and she thought to save you." His hand tightened on the dagger. Alice whimpered. "Did you ever think, your majesty, that perhaps it would have been better if she had kept her mouth shut?" William took a step forward. "Release the child, and I will give you a clean death, a quick one. I swear it on my mother's grave." Cedric's eyes flickered. For a moment, something like doubt crossed his face. Then he laughed again, and the sound was terrible. "Your mother's grave? Think, the woman who burned to death in her own chambers because no one came to save her. And you were what, 8 years old? 9? They say you watched from the garden. They say you were the last one to see her alive." Margaret saw William go still, completely, utterly still. "Do not speak of my mother." "Why not? It is the one true thing about you, isn't it? The great Iron King, the man who fears nothing, who still cannot stand near a fire without his hands shaking. I've seen it. Everyone has seen it. You are broken, Your Majesty, and you have been broken for 30 years. William said nothing, but Margaret, watching from the stairwell, saw his hand tremble on the sword. And then, through the wind, a small voice cut through. You're wrong. Alice had stopped crying. Her small face was streaked with tears, but her chin was lifted, her blue eyes fixed on Cedric with a defiance that seemed impossible in such a small child. The king is not broken, she said. He is kind. He leaves coins for me to find, and he says I am brave, and he promised to plant an apple tree for me in the spring. He is the best king in the whole world, and you are a bad man, and I'm not scared of you. Cedric stared at her, and in that moment of surprise, William moved. He crossed the distance in 3 strides, his sword sweeping up to knock Cedric's arm aside. Alice fell, tumbling to the stone, and Margaret screamed, but she was already running, already climbing the last few steps, already reaching for her daughter. William grappled with Cedric, the 2 men struggling at the edge of the parapet. There was a flash of steel, a grunt of pain, and then Cedric stumbled backward with a cry and pitched over the low wall. His scream lasted only a moment before it was cut short by the stones below. Margaret did not see it. She had reached Alice, gathering the sobbing child into her arms, pressing her face into her daughter's hair, whispering broken words of comfort. It's all right, my love. Mom is here, you're safe. Alice buried her face in her mother's shoulder, her small body shaking with sobs. I'm not scared, she hiccuped. I'm not scared, Mama, I'm not. I know, my brave girl, I know. And then she looked up and saw William. He was standing a few paces away, his sword lowered, his chest heaving. His face was gray beneath the morning light, and his left shoulder was dark with blood, spreading rapidly across the leather of his tunic. An arrow, she had not even seen it, jutted from the joint, the shaft broken, the head buried deep. William. She had never said his name before. It came out without thought, without caution, a raw and desperate sound. He looked at her, and for a moment, something in his face cracked. It's not deep, he said, though his voice was strained. The Oro, one of Cedric's men, in the tower window. He's dead now. Edmund. I don't care about Edmund. Margaret set Alice down gently, then crossed the distance to him, her hands reaching for his shoulder. You're bleeding. You need a surgeon. I need to know she's safe. His eyes went to Alice, who was standing now, wiping her face with the back of her hand, still trembling. Is she? She's safe. You saved her. You saved my little girl. William swayed. Margaret caught him, her hands gripping his arms, and for a moment they stood there, on the wind-scoured tower top, his blood warm on her fingers, her heart pounding against his chest. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for saving her. He looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers. I would do, think again 100 times, for both of you. And there, in the gray morning light, with the stones of the tower slick with blood and the wind howling around them, Margaret took his hand, his wounded, bloodied hand, and held it between both of hers. You are not broken, she said softly. Do you hear me, William of Ashford? You are not broken. He said nothing, but his fingers closed around hers and he held on. Below them the castle was stirring, guards were converging on the tower, Edmund's voice cutting through the chaos. But up here, in the wind and the dawn, there was only the 3 of them, the king, the maid, and the child who had saved them all. Alice walked over slowly, her small hand reaching up to touch William's arm. Does it hurt very much? A little, he admitted. I'm sorry you got hurt, she said gravely, but I'm glad you came. William looked at her, at the tear-streaked face, the trembling chin, the fierce blue eyes, and something in him seemed to loosen. He reached out, slowly, and placed his hand on top of her head. I will always come, he said. For you, for your mother, always. Alice nodded solemnly, as if this was exactly what she had expected him to say. And then, from below, Edmund's voice rang up the stairs. "Your Majesty, the tower is secure. We're coming up." William straightened, wincing as the movement pulled at his shoulder. He looked at Margaret, and for a moment the mask of the Iron King was gone, replaced by something raw, something real, something that made her heart ache. "The trial," he said. "It will be a formality now, but I want you there. I want them all to see who I am fighting for." Margaret nodded, her hand still clasping his. "I will be there," she said. "I will always be there." And below them the castle rang, the sound of running feet and shouting voices, and the sun broke over the eastern wall, gilding the towers in gold. The reckoning had come at last, and with it a beginning. The dawn came cold and clear, painting the castle walls in shades of gold and rose. The great courtyard was filled with people, nobles in their finery, servants in their plain woolens, guards and polished mail, all gathered to hear the king speak. William stood on the raised stone platform at the center of the courtyard, his left arm bound in a clean white sling. His voice carried across the silence like a bell. "Lord Cedric of the Hollow Vale is dead," he said. "He fell from the West Tower last night, after attempting to take a child hostage. That child, Alice, daughter of Margaret, Maid of the West Wing, is the same child who warned me of poisoned wine 6 weeks ago. She saved my life. Her mother sheltered her, protected her, and stood by her through every threat that followed." He paused. The crowd was utterly still. "Lord Cedric was the man who poisoned my cup. He confessed it before he died. He acted out of envy and ambition, believing that my death would place him in a position of power. He was wrong, and he has paid the price." A murmur rippled through the crowd. William raised his hand, and the murmur died. "But I did not call you here to speak of the dead. I called you here to speak of the living." He turned, and his eyes found Margaret standing at the edge of the crowd. She was wearing her best dress, plain but clean. And on her collar, pinned carefully, was the blue sapphire brooch that had once belonged to his mother. "Mistress Margaret of the West Wing," William said, and his voice softened in a way that made the crowd lean forward. "6 weeks ago, you and your daughter saved my life. You asked for nothing, you demanded nothing, you simply did what was right, and you did it at great risk to yourselves." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. Alice, standing beside her, squeezed her hand. "I have known many people in my life," William continued. "Some have sought my favor, some have sought my coin, some have sought my throne, but very few have ever sought my good without wanting something in return." He stepped down from the platform and walked toward them, his boots crunching on the frost-covered stones. "Margaret of the West Wing, you are no longer a maid of this castle. You are a guest of the crown, with all the rights and protections that title carries. And your daughter, Alice? She is a ward of the king's household, as dear to me as if she were my own blood." The crowd erupted. Gasps, whispers, a few scattered cheers. Margaret's knees went weak. She felt Alice tug at her sleeve. "Mama, does that mean we don't have to scrub the floors anymore?" A laugh rippled through the crowd, uncertain at first, then warm. Even the guards at the gate cracked a smile. Margaret knelt down and hugged her daughter tight. "No, my love. No more scrubbing." William stood before them, and when Margaret looked up, she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. It was not the cold, guarded mask of the Iron King. It was something raw, something vulnerable, something that made her heart ache. "There is much I have not told you," he said quietly. "Tonight, if you are willing, I would tell you. All of it." Margaret nodded slowly. "I would be honored, Your Majesty." His mouth curved, the barest hint of a smile. "William," he said, "you have earned the right to call me William." The crowd was still buzzing as they dispersed, but Margaret barely heard them. She was looking at the man before her, the Iron King of Ashford, the man whose name was feared across 3 valleys, and she saw for the first time the lonely boy beneath the crown. That night, the fire in the king's private study burned low and warm. Margaret sat in a high-backed chair near the hearth, her hands wrapped around a cup of mulled wine.
Alice had been tucked into bed an hour ago, after extracting a promise from William that he would tell her another story about the stars tomorrow. "She is remarkable," William said, settling into the chair opposite Margaret. His left shoulder was freshly bandaged, the sling discarded now that they were alone. "Most children would be asleep by now. She argued with me for a full 10 minutes about the proper way to tell a story." Margaret smiled. "She gets that from her father. He could argue the dew off the grass." The words hung in the air. It was the first time she had spoken of her late husband in William's presence. William was quiet for a long moment. Then he said softly, "What was his name?" "Thomas?" Margaret's voice was steady, though her fingers tightened around her cup. "Thomas of the Redfield. He was a soldier. He died in the border skirmishes. 3 years ago. Alice was 4. "I am sorry," William said, and there was something in his voice, a weight, a recognition that made Margaret look up. "You have lost someone too," she said. "It is not a question." William's jaw tightened. For a long moment he stared into the fire, and Margaret saw the flames reflected in his deep blue eyes. "My mother," he said at last. "She died when I was 6. A fire in the East Wing. She had gone back for my father's sword. It was a ceremonial piece, passed down through generations. She thought it was more important than her own."
Life. His voice was flat, measured, as if he had recited these words 1,000 times, but never felt them. My father never forgave her for it. He never forgave himself, either. He became cold, distant, obsessed with duty and discipline. He taught me that emotion was weakness, that trust was a trap, that the only thing a man could rely on was his own strength. Margaret said nothing. She simply waited. "I have not sat this close to a fire in 30 years, William said quietly. "Every time I do, I see her face, I hear the crackling, and I smell the smoke, and I am 6 years old again, standing in the courtyard in my nightshirt, watching the flames eat the East Wing while the servants hold me back." His voice cracked just slightly. "I could not save her. I was too small, too weak. And I have spent every day since then trying to be strong enough that it would never matter, that I would never need anyone, that I would never be helpless again." The fire crackled, a log shifted, sending up a shower of sparks. Margaret set down her cup. She rose from her chair, crossed the small distance between them, and knelt before his chair. Gently, she took his uninjured hand in both of hers. "You were a child," she said softly. "There was nothing you could have done." "I know that now," William said. "But knowing it and believing it are different things." She looked up at him, her gray-green eyes steady and warm. "I believe it," she said, "and I will keep believing it, for both of us, until you can believe it too." William stared at her. His hand in hers was trembling, the hand of a man who had held a sword through 100 battles, trembling like a leaf in autumn wind. "Why?" he asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. "Why would you do that for me? You barely know me. I have been cold, distant, difficult. I have given you every reason to walk away." Margaret smiled. It was a sad, gentle smile, the kind that came from a woman who had seen her share of grief. "Because I know what it is to lose someone," she said, "and I know what it is to blame yourself for it. Thomas died on the border, but I spent a year wondering if I could have done something, said something, written a different letter, begged him not to re-enlist. I know the weight of that guilt. I know how it presses on your chest until you forget what it feels like to breathe without pain." She squeezed his hand. "You do not have to carry it alone anymore, not if you do not want to." The fire crackled. The wind rattled the windows. And William of Ashford, the Iron King, the man who had not wept in 30 years, felt the tears slide down his cheeks, hot and unfamiliar. "I do not know how to do this," he said, his voice rough. "I do not know how to be this, soft, open, trusting." "Neither do I," Margaret admitted. "But I think we can learn together." He laughed, a broken, wet sound, but a laugh nonetheless. He reached up with his good hand and wiped his face, embarrassed. "You should not be kneeling on the cold stone," he said. "You will catch a chill." "I have knelt on colder floors,"
she said lightly. "At least this one has a fire." He looked at her, and something shifted in his eyes. A thaw, slow and deep, like the ice breaking on the river at spring thaw. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his tunic and drew out a small object, the blue sapphire brooch she had worn that morning. "You already gave me this," Margaret said, confused. "I gave you permission to wear it," William said, "but I did not give you the truth of it. It was my mother's. She wore it every day, even to the kitchens, even to the garden. My father used to tease her about it, said she would wear it to her grave." He stopped, swallowed. "She was wearing it when she died. They found it in the ashes, months later. The stone had cracked, but the gold held." Margaret took the brooch from his hand, turning it over. In the firelight, she could see the fine hairline crack running through the sapphire. "I had it repaired," William said quietly. "I could not bear to lose it. But I have carried it in a box for 30 years, because I could not bear to wear it either. It reminded me too much of her." He looked at Margaret, and his voice was soft. "Today, when I saw you wearing it, I did not feel pain. I felt warmth. Like she would have wanted it to be worn, not hidden in a box. Like it had found a home at last." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. She turned the brooch over in her hands, tracing the delicate gold filigree with her thumb. "I will treasure it," she said. "I will wear it every day, and I will think of her. And of you." William reached out and gently closed her fingers around the brooch. "It has already found its home," he said. "You and Alice, you are its home now, if you will have it, if you will have me." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Margaret looked at him, this proud, wounded, impossibly gentle man, and felt her heart open like a flower in the sun. "I will," she said. "I will have you, all of you. The Iron King, and the lonely boy, and the man who tells stories about stars to a 7-year-old girl." William let out a breath he did not know he had been holding. He reached down, took her hand, and drew her up from her knees into the chair beside him. "Then I have one more story to tell you," he said. "About a boy who was afraid of the fire, and a woman who taught him it could be warm. And there, in the low glow of the hearth, with the wind crying outside the windows and the castle settling into sleep around them, William of Ashford told his story, and Margaret listened. High above, in the west wing, a small girl with golden hair slept with a smooth, round stone clutched in her hand, a good-night stone from the king, who had left it on her pillow before the trial. In her dreams, she was walking through a garden of stars, holding the hand of a tall man with kind eyes. And for the first time in 30 years, the castle of Ashford felt not like a fortress, but like a home. Spring came to Ashford the way it always did, slowly, reluctantly, as if the northern hills had to be persuaded to let go of winter. The snow melted in fits and starts, retreating from the valley floor in muddy patches, clinging to the shadowed hollows long after the meadows had turned green. But when it finally came, it came all at once. The orchards burst into white and pink blossoms, the streams ran clear and loud, and the castle windows were thrown open for the first time in months to let in air that smelled of damp earth and new grass. Margaret stood at the window of her new rooms in the west wing, watching the sunlight pour across the courtyard. It was a modest set of chambers, a sitting room with a worn but comfortable chair, a small bedchamber for her, and a narrow room for Alice that the girl had already filled with her treasures, a collection of smooth stones, a bird's feather, the blue silk ribbon William had given her for her birthday. They were not grand rooms by any measure, but they were hers and Alice's, and the windows faced the garden. "Mama, look!" Alice came running in, her cheeks flushed, her golden cup air escaping the braid Margaret had carefully tied that morning. In her pupped hands she carried something small and wriggling. "A caterpillar," Alice announced, holding it up for inspection. "He's green and fuzzy, and he's going to be a butterfly. Can we keep him?" Margaret smiled. "We can keep him until he's ready to fly, then we have to let him go. That's what the king said," Alice said matter-of-factly, and ran out again before Margaret could ask what else the king had said.
Margaret watched her go, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the spring sun. 5 months had passed since the trial. 5 months since Lord Cedric's body had been found at the base of the eastern tower, since the truth had been spoken aloud in the great hall, since she and Alice had been led to these rooms by the king himself. 5 months since her life had turned inside out and settled into something she had never dared to imagine. She had not expected to be happy. She had expected to be safe, perhaps. Safe was already more than she had ever hoped for, but happiness had crept up on her like the spring itself. Slow and then sudden, until she woke one morning to find that the fear had loosened its grip on her heart, and the grief had softened into something she could carry without it breaking her. There was a knock at the door. Margaret turned, expecting Elena with her endless supply of tea and advice, but it was not the housekeeper. It was William, standing in the doorway in a plain linen shirt with his sleeves rolled up, his dark hair rumpled, a streak of dirt across his cheek. "Your Majesty," she said, and the title came out with a smile in it, because they both knew by now that it was a formality, a game they played in front of the servants. "Mistress Margaret."
Think. 1. The bee replied, equally formal, equally warm. "I was hoping you might come to the garden. There is something I would like to show you." She followed him down the winding stairs and out through the kitchen courtyard, where the cook was already shouting at a scullery boy about a burned pot, and the scullery boy was already not listening. The castle had settled into a rhythm that was almost ordinary now. The guards still stood at their posts, but their shoulders were looser. The servants still hurried about their tasks, but they smiled more often. Even the walls seemed to have relaxed, as if they had been holding their breath for decades and had finally let it out. The garden was at the far end of the keep, tucked between the old armory and the southern wall. It had been neglected for years. The king had no interest in flowers, and the gardeners had long since been reassigned to more practical tasks. But in the past few months, someone had been clearing it. The brambles were gone, the soil had been turned, and along the southern wall, where the sun lingered longest, a row of young fruit trees had been planted. Margaret stopped at the edge of the garden, her breath catching. The trees were small, no taller than her shoulder, their branches just beginning to unfurl pale green leaves. And at the far end, in the corner where the wall met the old armory, stood one tree that was different from the others. A young apple tree, its trunk straight and true, its roots still settling into the freshly turned earth. William walked to it and stopped, his hand resting on the slender trunk. "This one is yours," he said. "Yours and Alice's." Margaret's throat tightened. She stepped forward slowly, her fingers brushing one of the small green leaves. "An apple tree?" she said, and her voice came. Think. Out, softer than she intended. "Apples," William said. "For pies, and for the child who likes to climb things she should not climb." Margaret laughed, a small, surprised sound that turned into something close to a sob. She pressed her hand to her mouth, and William took a step toward her, his eyes searching her face. "Maggie." He rarely used the name, only in moments when formality fell away. "I know I cannot give you back what you lost. I know I cannot undo the years before we met. But I can give you this. A place where you can put down roots. A place that is yours. Not a servant's room, not a guest's chamber, but a home." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Margaret felt the weight of them, the enormity of what he was offering. He was not a man who spoke easily. Every word he gave her had been paid for in silence, in hesitation, in the careful weighing of a heart that had been broken once, and had learned to fear the cost of trust. She looked at the tree, at its young branches reaching toward the sun, and she thought of all the winters she had survived. The cold, the hunger, the fear that had been her constant companion since Thomas had died. She thought of Alice, growing tall and brave in a castle that had once been a fortress of ice. She thought of the man standing beside her, who had learned to laugh again, who had learned to read bedtime stories without stumbling, who had learned to stand near a fire without flinching. "William," she said, and his name on her lips felt like a key turning in a lock. "I have been afraid for so long that I forgot what it felt like to be safe. But you have given me more than a home. You have given me a reason to believe that I deserve one." He reached out, slowly, as if afraid she might disappear, and took her hand. His fingers were warm and calloused, the hand of a soldier,
the hand of a man who had spent his life holding swords and had only recently learned to hold something gentler. "I have spent 30 years learning to trust no one," he said. "It has taken me 5 months to unlearn it. You have been patient with me, Maggie, more patient than I deserved."
"I have been patient," she said, "because I knew what I was waiting for." The words sat between them, heavy and bright. William's grip on her hand tightened, and he looked down at their joined fingers, his thumb tracing a slow circle on her palm. "There is something I have been wanting to ask you," he said, "but I have been afraid to hear the answer." "Then ask me," she said gently. "Whatever it is, I would rather hear the question than wonder at the silence." He took a breath, and then he looked up at her, fully, openly, the way he had looked at her that first night in the great hall, when she had stood frozen before him, with her daughter's hand in hers, and the taste of fear in her mouth. But his eyes were different now. There was no ice in them, no wall of distance. Just a man, standing in the spring sun, offering her his heart with both hands. "Will you stay?" he asked. "Not as a guest, not as the woman who saved my life, but as—" He stopped, swallowed. "As my family. As my own. I know I am not an easy man. I know I have more scars than I have softness, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you, if you will let me." The words fell into the quiet garden like seeds into tilled soil. Margaret stood very still, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat, her eyes stinging with tears she did not try to hold back. "Yes," she said. And then, because the word was too small for everything she felt, she said it again, louder. "Yes, William, yes, I will stay. I will stay forever, if you will have me." He pulled her into his arms, and for a long moment they stood there wrapped in each other, the young apple tree casting its thin shadow across the fresh earth at their feet. The sun was warm on Margaret's shoulders, and the wind smelled of blossoms, and somewhere in the castle a child was laughing, and William's arms were solid and real around her, and she felt, for the first time in her life, that she had come home. "Forever," he murmured into her hair. "Forever," she promised. That evening they celebrated. Elena produced a pie from the kitchens, not apple, for the tree was too young, but a fine berry pie with a golden crust, and insisted that Alice help her serve it, which meant that Alice ate most of the filling and left the crust on everyone else's plates. William laughed, a full, warm laugh that still made the servants pause and exchange glances, because the sound was still new enough to be remarkable. Margaret watched him with Alice, watched the way he bent down to listen to her serious pronouncements about caterpillars and butterflies, watched the way his hand rested on the child's shoulder with a gentleness that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Later, after Alice had been tucked into bed, after the good-night stone had been placed on the pillow, and the story had been told, and the nightlight had been lit, Margaret stood on the balcony of her rooms, looking out at the garden below. The moon was rising over the eastern wall, silvering the young apple tree, turning its leaves to pale coins. William came up behind her and slipped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "She asked me today," he said softly, "if the apple tree would grow as tall as the castle." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that it would grow as tall as she needed it to be, and that when she is grown, she can come back and see it, and it will still be here, waiting for her." Margaret turned in his arms, facing him. In the moonlight, his face was all shadows and silver, the scar over his brow a pale thread. She reached up and touched it, gently, the way she had touched his wounds that night in the tower room. "William," she said, "the apple tree, it will still be here in 100 years. But I don't need 100 years. I just need today and tomorrow and the day after that." He pressed his forehead to hers, closing his eyes. "Then that is what I will give you, one day at a time, for the rest of our lives." And there, in the spring moonlight, with the wind soft and the garden quiet and the castle settling into its first peaceful sleep in decades, Margaret of the West Wing, Margaret of no family, no fortune, no name but her own, held the Iron King of Ashford in her arms
and felt the last of her fear slip away like the last of the winter snow. The apple tree would grow, the castle would stand, the seasons would turn as they always had, as they always would. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the green hills of Ashford, the king would wake with a smile on his face and a woman beside him, and a child with golden hair would come running in to announce that the caterpillar had made its cocoon. Spring had come to Ashford, and it had come to stay.
The Iron King's frozen heart finally melted, completely disarmed by a humble maid and her brave little girl. Even the coldest winter eventually gives way to spring. If you were in their shoes, would you have risked your life to warn the king? Let me know your choice in the comments below. If this story warmed your heart, please like and subscribe for more romantic tales.